Chapter 316. A meteor flashed across the dark sky. Yi Haoren's flying sword also fell towards Ding Ning's back like a meteor. Seeing this scene, many of the spectating Min mountain sword sect cultivators couldn't help but feel cold. There was a time difference at any moment in a battle. Many times, the timing was determined by the small time difference. When Ding Ning used the true peacock green, Yi Haoren's defense had not been able to completely block it. Now that he used this flying sword to attack, the time difference meant that he could not deal with Ding Ning's next attack. Even if Ding Ning used the simplest sword form, if he could reach him, he would not be able to stop it. Therefore, his current actions meant that he had chosen to perish together with them. From the start of the trials, Ding Ning had shown that winning was more important than life and death. So in the view of these cultivators, victory was more important to Ding Ning than life and death. If Yi Haoren attacked someone else like this, other people might dodge out of fear of death, but Ding Ning would not retreat. The result was that both of them would die. While all the cultivators hoped that Ding Ning could win, they had to admit that this youth from the Chu dynasty was a madman and a monster. There was too little time. Before anyone could think about what choice Ding Ning would make, Ding Ning had made his choice. Countless fine, white flowers bloomed on the last flower remnant sword. These fine flowers and sword essence were moving forward, but in this moment, the last flower remnant sword was forced to bend backwards. There was an explosion. Everyone felt as though their hearts had been hit. Ding Ning gave a muffled grunt. For the first time, his body lost its balance, and he stumbled forward several steps. Zhang Yi opened his mouth, but could not make a sound. His vital energy instinctively surged towards his feet, and he was about to leap forward. The hearts of Dugu, Bai, and the others sank to the bottom. Jing Liuli's breathing paused slightly, and his expression grew ugly. Yi Haoren laughed. "It's over." That was what he said in his heart. Then, in his mind, he released the boundary that had been restricting the flow of his true essence. The remaining true qi in his body flowed freely and without reservation through his meridians. In that instant, it gushed out from the 5 fingers of his left hand. A vast presence that all the students present felt they could not resist exploded with him as the center. Other than Yi Haoren, all the students in the mountain valley were realm 3 or 4 in vital energy cultivation. What Yi Haoren displayed now was true realm 5 power. Countless mottled colors appeared on Yi Haoren's face. He did not hold back and used all of his power. The poison immediately flared up. However, the smile at the corner of his mouth grew even wider. Everyone could sense that an invisible river had appeared in the air. This long river flowed into the small white hiltless sword that had just been sent flying backwards by Ding Ning's attack. The small white sword gave off a wild presence. Due to the rapid acceleration and vibrations, the entire sword immediately became translucent. Yi Haoren did not fight the pain. Seeing the small white sword fly back to Ding Ning's back, he followed his body's will and fell backwards. "I admit defeat." At the same time he spoke, this was also a time difference. According to the rules of the trials, if one admitted defeat, they would lose. However, at this moment, his sword was definitely faster than his voice. Such a fast sword. After piercing and shattering Ding Ning's heart, Ding Ning would not immediately die. With Ding Ning's strong resolve, he could probably stand for a few more breaths. The final result of this grand event that attracted the attention of the world was that he admitted defeat. And Ding Ning won first place, but Ding Ning would die next. Zhang Yi's body had left the ground and was flying at a speed exceeding his usual limits. But no matter how fast his body was, he could not be faster than that flying sword, and could not block in front of that flying sword. Everyone was certain that Ding Ning could not stop this sword. This had nothing to do with talent, but a difference in pure power. But at this time, Ding Ning's body gave off an unusual scent. His skin started to become mottled. The last flower remnant, sword in his hand, lit up with threads of light. Then the entire last flower sword turned into countless tiny threads that started to weave in the air. Yantai Guanjian's tense expression relaxed, and then his eyes were filled with shock and admiration. At this time, only he had the time to sense a wondrous and beautiful scene. The tiny sword threads dancing in the air had even finer white flowers. These sword threads crisscrossed like cloth and were tightly entangled together. Who would have thought that the broken last flower sword could be used like this? The white flying sword crashed into the sword threads. The sword threads could not match the power of the white flying sword, but these tightly woven sword threads were like a net or even a cocoon. They firmly held onto this flying sword and bought Ding Ning a sliver of time. Ding Ning's fingertips that gripped the sword sprayed out a fine mist of blood. He could no longer hold the last flower remnant sword, but using the pull of this sword, his body was forcefully tilted in this tiny moment. Poof! The white flying sword carried the last flower remnant sword and charged into his left shoulder socket. Then it came out behind his body with a spray of blood. The bones in his left shoulder were almost completely shattered, but this sword was unable to pierce and crush his heart. The shattered sword energy and the spray of blood gave off soft, hissing sounds. At this time, Yi Haoran finally said the first of the three words, "I admit defeat." Everything seemed to have frozen, but Yi Haoran's admission of defeat still reached everyone's ears and appeared strange. Zhang Yi had charged to Ding Ning's side. He reached over and supported Ding Ning's body. He felt that Ding Ning's body seemed to be weightless, but he did not know what he should do. Wonderful! Just as Zhang Yi's mind was blank, loud cheers sounded, followed by applause. The one clapping was Lin Suixin. Then many Min mountain sword sect cultivators in the darkness started to clap. Even the distant mountain paths gave off clear applause. Zhang Yi felt a wild wind blow past, and then his hand became even lighter. Yantai Guanjian's figure had disappeared, and so had Ding Ning in his hand. Why admit defeat? Why admit defeat and kill Ding Ning? He wants Ding Ning to win the Min Mountain Sword Trials and wants to use this chance to kill Ding Ning. Everything was settled. Jing Liuli thought seriously with a bowed head and murmured to herself. Li Lingjun does not want the Empress to win. He does not want the Empress to be happy, but he hates Ding Ning. He wants Ding Ning to die. The legendary benevolent and modest gentleman is a vengeful and narrow-minded person. He is not useful and will be a mediocre ruler in the future. In a flash, she understood why Yi Haoran had done this and made a judgment about the future of the new king of Chu. So, he risked his body being dismembered to slowly exhaust Yi Haoran's true essence. Then, he used the peacock green and used the blood fiend devil art to force out Yi Haoran's final sword. All of this was under his control. Then she started to recall every detail of the battle just now and was shocked again. She found that while this result was Yi Haoran's choice, Yi Haoran did not have a choice in the end. As Ding Ning continued to bleed, Yi Haoran's vital energy was also consumed. In the end, when Ding Ning used the blood fiend demon art, Yi Haoran did not have much vital energy left. Therefore, for Yi Haoran, it was already the right time. Is this what Master said? I lack the ability to stay out of the situation and see the big picture. Jing Liuli slowly exhaled and was silent for a long time. She had thought of many things, but the entire valley was just starting to wake up. Waves of cries of disbelief rang out unceasingly. Xia Ro looked at the place where Ding Ning had blocked Yi Haoran's last blow. Her body and lips trembled, so she could not speak. He is first. Li Shixing said these words simply. At this time, he was the calmest of the group. He will not die. Then this youth who seemed to be afraid of the cold straightened his collar and said seriously, I am sure. Li Shixing's voice was steady and loud. He is first, he will not die. This kind of voice suppressed many cries of surprise and echoed in the valley. Zhang Yi started to recover. He sensed all the mountains were echoing. He sensed the gazes of all the students and cultivation teachers. He looked at the blood that Ding Ning had spilled on the ground and sensed that the blood was shining. Even though it was night, he sensed light coming down from the sky. He looked up and seemed to see Shui, Wangshu smiling at him, and the entire valley with a satisfied and mischievous smile. He knew this was glory, the glory that his little sect brother brought. Chapter 317. Ding Ning won? This youth from White Goat Cave really won the Min Mountain Sword Trials. While everyone knew this was the truth, many people still did not dare to believe that this youth from White Goat Cave had won against Palace Attendant Rong's arrangements and the will of the Empress who had never been defeated. Looking at these dazed students and cultivators, Lin Suixin put down the scroll in his hand, cleared his throat, and announced with a rare faint smile, the Min Mountain Sword Trials have ended. Ding Ning is first. Lin Suixin was the organizer of the last sword trials and represented all of Min Mountain Sword sect. When his voice sounded, everyone was startled awake and accepted this truth. Many students looked at each other. They were usually the best of the best and were very proud. But at this time, they did not see any dissatisfaction in each other's eyes. No one dared to be dissatisfied. No one would be dissatisfied because Ding Ning had shown so much power in the trials that they may never be able to catch up in their lifetime. They then looked towards Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi's side was empty. Ding Ning was not there right now, but everyone knew he was alive, and the glory that followed belonged to him. Missing at the moment, when he should be the center of attention, was like Ding Ning's usual calmness. They felt uncomfortable. It was as though he disdained to enjoy their shock, jealousy, and admiration. Could Ding Ning's calmness towards them be understood as disdain to explain, and disdain to be with them? The valley grew silent. Each Min Mountain Sword Trials was different, but the trials were usually very lively at the end. Many people congratulated, many people wept, and many people cheered victory. But never had it been so silent. The glory was so great that people felt ashamed of their own inferiority. A green palace in the mountains pierced the sky like a sword. On the peak, Bailey Sushua, dressed in white robes, looked silently at the scene in the valley. He suddenly found it amusing. A person like him could not suppress his emotions. So he laughed out loud. Clear and melodious laughter drifted into the valley along with the mountain wind and the sound of cicadas. All the teachers in the valley heard this laughter. While they could not see Bailey Sushua's figure, they knew from the dominance in the laughter that this was the master of Min Mountain Sword sect. Hearing Bailey Sushua's laughter, these people felt even more emotional. This was especially true for people with special identities and statuses. On the mountain path, the middle-aged man in yellow robes who had replied for palace attendant Rong stood motionless for a long time like he had turned into a statue. On the other hand, Sikong Lin, the vice bureau chief of the Bureau of Rights, was so excited that his entire body trembled uncontrollably. Huang Jinwei turned to look in the direction of Bailey Sushua's laughter, a hint of admiration in his eyes. Pan Rui shook her head and said with a cold expression, I don't think she will stop here. His Majesty is still in this mountain. Then she said in an even colder voice, even if it is against the Empress arrangements, Bailey Sushua's actions are too presumptuous. In reality, she is a very qualified mistress. Huang Jinwei rarely argued with Pan Rui, but at this time he shook his head and expressed a different opinion. No one in Chongling is more suited to be a mistress because she knows how to balance and control better than anyone else. Our Qin dynasty has Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate. After a pause, Huang Jinwei looked at Pan Rui and said, "The Qin dynasty can lose Min Mountain Sword Sect, but we cannot lose these two major cultivation places together. Even more importantly, if we lose Min Mountain Sword Sect, we will quickly lose Lingshu Sword Gate." Pan Rui thought for a moment and said, "Because there will be no sense of security?" Huang Jinwei was shocked that Pan Rui could understand so quickly. He nodded and said softly, "A sense of security is a wondrous feeling. Some people would rather have a powerful opponent than see that powerful opponent disappear. Because powerful opponents can often help each other. If you are alone, the uncertainty and lack of security is enough for a person to do something completely different." Pan Rui looked expressionlessly at all the cultivators in the mountain valley and said slowly, "The cultivators of Chongling do not have much sense of security, but she knows where the boundary is. So she will make the cultivators of Chongling feel insecure, but not too insecure." Huang Jinwei felt that her conclusion was accurate. He was also surprised that Pan Rui would say these things. So he looked at Pan Rui and did not know what to say. Pan Rui did not say anything, since she had stayed here to see the final result, and the result was already decided. She had no need to stay. So she nodded at Huang Jinwei and turned to leave. Her beautiful figure quickly disappeared into the shadows of the mountain path. The resting camp was even more deathly silent than the mountain valley. Many of the officials moving through the camp intentionally avoided Palace Attendant Rong's tent with fearful eyes. They felt that Palace Attendant Rong would be furious right now. No one was willing to be tainted by her anger at this moment. Yet, no one had expected Palace Attendant Rong to show no anger in the tent. She was deep in thought with her head bowed. Where did Lai Yinghong go? When all the students accepted the fact that Ding Ning had won the Min Mountain Sword Trials, someone finally recalled the name that had always been first on the Book of Talents: Yi Haoren and Ku Shichuan. Even though they had lost to Ding Ning in the end, they still showed strength far surpassing ordinary students. Lai Yinghong was first on the Book of Talents. How could he have fallen into the sea of brambles? Also, everyone knew that Lai Yinghong from Jiaodong Commandery should have been Palace Attendant Rong's most important pawn. While most of the cultivation teachers had seen with their own eyes how Lai Yinghong had left, these cultivation teachers had not had many chances to interact with these students after entering the mountain valley to watch the trials. So none of the students knew what Lai Yinghong had encountered. Lai Yinghong was defeated by Xie Changsheng and Shen Yi. Multiple cultivation teachers spoke at the same time and answered that student's question. The mountain valley was silent for a moment and then exploded with a boom. Of the people who had followed Ding Ning, only Xie Changsheng and Shen Yi had not entered the final trials. Yet, who would have thought that they had defeated one of Ding Ning's most important enemies? In the end, this seemed to be White Goat Cave's victory from start to finish. Many students thought bitterly that Ding Ning and these people had won from start to finish. Ding Ning wins, first place. Ding Ning is alive. A court official walked out of the sword gate of Min Mountain Sword Sect and rode a carriage to a patch of wilderness. There was a large carriage parked in the wilderness. Inside the carriage, a black-robed man with a calm presence and a dangerous feeling held a pot of hot tea. Opposite him sat a plain-robed man. Hearing the news this court official brought, the black-robed man and the plain-robed man laughed. The two exchanged a look. The plain-robed man could not help but say, "The impossible has been done. This Chongling has countless possibilities." Night still shrouded Chongling. The distant fires had been extinguished long ago, but an even more dangerous presence flowed through the air. Bai Shanshui moved through the streets of Chongling. She walked carefully, each rise and fall of her body ensuring that she would not be seen by any of the turrets in Chongling. She was not far from the outskirts of Chongling and a branch of the Wei River, yet a sword-like cold light flashed through her eyes. The moment she stopped walking, a figure walked out of the alley to the left, in front of her. He stopped under the black roof and looked at her silently. "Since you have returned to Chongling, you should have told me." A low but unusually steady and deep voice rang out. "Liang Lian, General Liang." Bai Shanshui's eyes narrowed slightly, her heart trembling. She sneered and said, "I guessed it was you. You can come and go as you please and do not need to inform me. But I cannot be at ease in this city." Liang Lian, who was standing straight under the roof, looked at Bai Shanshui and said coldly and decisively, "In reality, I do not want much. I do not want you to die. I only want you to hand over the Lonely Mountain sword hoard." Bai Shanshui laughed and said, "This is not much." Liang Lian shook his head. "Is some unreachable old dreams more important than life and death? Even that person and the Bazin Kendo ground will disappear. What is impossible in Chongling?" Bai Shanshui put away her smile, puffed out her chest, and said slowly, "Also, you do not want the Lonely Mountain sword hoard, but her. You need her pity to survive. So how can you pity me? Why do I need pity?" Bai Shanshui looked up. A glowing drop of water appeared in the sky. Chapter 3:18. Rain inexplicably fell on Chongling's Sun Alley. This rain only covered this part of the street. In an area of nearly 1,000 feet, the neighboring streets had become incomparably dry. Even the drought-resistant wormwood on the roof tiles had suddenly lost its moisture, turning from dark green to withered yellow. Yet none of the residents in this alley detected anything unusual. They did not even hear the sound of rain. Before the rain fell, some white smoke had spread with the wind. This white smoke carried a sweet scent and caused the people who had been sleeping to sleep even more deeply. The clean rain washed the dust from the roof tiles and the cracks on the ground, but could not wash away the darkness in Bai Shanshui's brow. Only a few dozen breaths had passed since the first drop of water fell to the torrential rain, but she already felt tired. After the battle on the Wei River, her cultivation had not recovered. At this time, there were more than 30 flying swords flying through the air around her, hiding in the wind and rain, hiding above the roof tiles, hiding in the muddy water formed by rainwater. They even disguised themselves as withered grass that was blown by the wind, floating in the gutter with the waves and slowly approaching her body. None of these flying swords were a match for her. Most of the masters of the flying swords were far from her cultivation right now, and were not a match for her. But there were too many flying swords. It took too much effort to maintain vigilance against all these flying swords. Even more importantly, she knew that the masters of these flying swords were just pawns for the Qin dynasty army to use up her strength. In the surrounding night sky, she needed to focus on sensing the swords that had yet to appear. 2 twisted flying swords fell on the ground next to her, like dragonflies that had been stepped on after having their wings torn off. They looked terrible. Just by paying the price of 2 flying swords, they were able to delay her in this alley for a few dozen breaths. This could only mean that the organizer of this ambush was too good, looking at the flying swords that were not in a hurry to get close, and were just patrolling. Bai Shanshui knew she could not hold back at all. Her bright red lips pursed into a thin line, her tongue curled slightly, and a golden glass-like pill that she had been suppressing under her tongue quietly slipped out and bumped into her teeth. The pill shattered in her mouth, and the golden liquid flowed down her throat into her stomach. Her thin brows were slightly furrowed. She didn't know if it was heartache or real pain. Then she stretched out her left hand and used her index and middle fingers as a sword to stab above the eaves on the left. A low, suppressed shout rang out. A gray silhouette seemed to emerge from the black tiles and flew backwards with a curtain of blood. At the same time, a crystalline water droplet that was completely different from the surrounding rain appeared in the sky above by Shan Shui. The reason why it was so different was because there was no dust in this drop of water. It repelled all the dust in the air and even repelled the moisture in the surroundings. This drop of water seemed to have come from the heavens and did not belong to this mortal world. However, as it rapidly fell, countless fine ripples began to vibrate within the sparkling droplet, as if it was made by nature. Bai Shanshui's brows began to loosen. The water droplet fell faster and faster, brighter and brighter. The entire sky above her began to tremble. Her body seemed to have completely recovered, and an astonishing amount of heaven and earth essence chi began to gather from all directions. The clouds moved in all directions. Even the water on the ground, which had been flowing along the ground, began to tremble and flow toward her. In the darkness, many cultivators looked in shock at the growing power contained in the water droplet. They all felt a mountain falling from the sky. A thick green sword light came out of Bai Shanshui's hand. The power contained in the water droplet grew unimaginable. There was a hiss. A circular wave of energy exploded in the sky. All the falling rain droplets exploded into mist. The water droplet passed through the mist, and the roof tiles in this alley were crushed. The long sword in Bai Shanshui's hand, which was like a jade pool, welcomed this drop of sparkling liquid. The droplets that fell with a mountainous aura did not seep into the blade of her sword. Instead, as she narrowed her eyes, a cold light flashed in her eyes, and the droplets were shattered by the sword in her hand. Even smaller droplets of water splashed out. It was like a real mountain had been shattered by a sword in this space. Every tiny droplet of water was like a huge rock that had been thrown out. There were countless rocks flying in this space. Clang, 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 dense and heavy sounds of collisions sounded. All the flying swords that had been flying through the curtain of rain around Bai Shanshui all fell to the ground. In the darkness, balls of bloody mist sprayed out. It was just a drop of water, but it had brought about such a shocking and desolate scene. Bai Shanshui did not show any pride. She knew this was just the beginning. An extremely domineering shout burst out from her mouth. At the same time, her body passed through the falling flying swords and through more than a dozen courtyards. A thick yellow sword light appeared in front of her, violently slashing towards her flying body. Bang! A muffled sound. The hairband she used to tie her hair suddenly snapped, and her black hair fell to her shoulders like a waterfall. She and her sword were forced back dozens of feet by this wild sword light. She was forced back by a sword. As time passed, she still did not manage to charge out of this alley. She had a bitter taste in her mouth. She knew that most of the Chongling experts who were a threat to her were in Min Mountain or not far from Min Mountain Sword Sect. Also, Liang Lien wanted to atone for his crimes by merit. He would not give this merit to others. So even if there were cultivators of her level here, there would be very few. Even if it was this cultivator who had forced her back, she had enough confidence to deal with him. But she lacked a personal attendant. She could not divide her attention to deal with the flying swords that could come at any time when she was dealing with a cultivator of this level, and there was more than one. Also, there was Liang Lien, who had yet to act. If her senior sect brother was still here, maybe he could tear apart a corner of the encirclement. But her senior sect brother had died long ago. As though hearing the call of her heart, a sharp sword hum suddenly sounded between the white walls and black tiles. Pew, 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 more than a dozen sounds of flesh being torn apart sounded. A meteor-like sword light, carrying the scent of blood, flew to her side. After killing more than a dozen cultivators surrounding her, it flew to her side like it was protecting her. The sword essence was facing in front of her. In anyone's first impression, this was a sword that would fight alongside her. Bai Shan thought so. However, in the next instant, she suddenly noticed that something was wrong, and her expression turned cold. The sword in her hand, that was like a jade pool, slashed towards the flying sword. The meteor-like sword light gave off a wild hum and sped up. When it was hit by Bai Shan's sword, the entire blade bent and gave off a wild and bloodthirsty presence, spinning past Bai Shan's side. The side of Bai Shan's robe tore open soundlessly and was instantly filled with blood. Bai Shan's eyes burned with anger. All was deceit in war. This was a clever tactic in battle, but she did not like to be deceived. In this moment, she did not even focus on sensing the large sword in front of her that could attack at any time, and the most sinister flying sword that was imitating dried grass as it floated towards her. She focused on sensing Liang Lian's presence that had been hidden since the start of the battle. Even if it was meaningless, she would enjoy the last moment. Liang Lian wanted to keep her. Since she was fated to not be able to leave, then she would kill Liang Lian first. However, at this moment, several broken tiles fell from the eaves. The several broken tiles fell into the ditch where the flying sword disguised as withered grass was creating several splashes of water. A splash flew out of the muddy water under the flying sword. It was very strange, but no one noticed. The water splashed high. When it reached a height that surpassed common sense and did not fall, the cultivator who had forced Bai Shan to retreat suddenly felt something was wrong. But his attention was not on that side, because there was his companion, a powerful cultivator's flying sword disguised as dried grass. Therefore, just as he was about to react and defend himself with his sword, the splash of water had already leaped into the air and landed on his neck. With a light touch, the head of the cultivator who had forced Bai Shan to retreat separated from his body and flew out. "Protect me." A familiar voice sounded. When the voice sounded, Bai Shan took a deep breath. Her flying figure smashed towards the courtyard, where the person was like a wave. Pew, 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 pew. There was a violent sound in the air. Many flying swords and weapons with cold light fell towards this cultivator, who was not part of the plan. Bai Shan attacked. The wave-like sword light swept away all the cold light, falling towards the cultivator. She landed next to the person in the courtyard. Her body trembled continuously, but her hand holding the sword was exceptionally steady. Previously, she needed a personal attendant, but now she was like this person's personal attendant. Chapter 319. Your flying sword is very strong. Bai Shan said to the person in the courtyard, "But you may die." "I was a dead person long ago." The cultivator in the courtyard looked at Bai Shan and shook his head. He said softly, "Do not misunderstand. I just want to ensure that you do not fall into their hands alive. If such a time comes, I will kill you first. Please do the same to me, and do not let me fall into their hands alive." Bai Shan smiled in satisfaction when he heard these impolite words. He lifted his head and said, "Very good." A wild wind rose, and the night was in chaos. More than a dozen white lines appeared in the sky and fell towards the courtyard. These white lines were either sword formations created by cultivators of the sword schools or powerful weapons. Even from far away, one could feel the terrifying power contained within. But the cultivator next to Bai Shan did not pay attention to these white lines. Even as he spoke to Bai Shan his mind was firmly focused on his thin flying sword. His flying sword was very short. When it flew out of the turbid water, it was mottled with the same color as the turbid water. Yet, when the sword cut off the head of the expert under Liang Lian, his sword turned into a restrained deep purple. As he spoke to Bai Shui, his flying sword broke free of the entanglement of a bright white flying sword, broke through the roof, and passed through the body of a gray-robed old man. The moment the gray-robed old man's bloody mist surged, the small sword that had been drifting like a leaf in the ditch suddenly fell to the ground. Boom! The gray-robed old man fell like a mountain into a narrow space filled with junk. He looked at the fatal wound at his heart and shouted in discontent, "Fan Zhuo is dead. Where did this person come from?" Looking at the young cultivator next to Bai Shui, who was barely visible in the darkness, everyone who had participated in the encirclement was similarly shocked and puzzled. No one knew that this young person came from the Chu. No one knew that his name was Li Yunrui. This nameless cultivator, who had suddenly appeared, was like heir to Chongling. Bai Shui did not care about Li Yunrui's flying sword. She looked up at the sky. Those white lines in the sky carried a pure and holy aura. They were actually a dozen heavenly fires condensed from the natural energies. Bai Shui was certain that the sky fire was the work of Zheng Xiu when she sensed the cold and perfect qi. However, what she found hard to understand was that although the sky fire was equally powerful, it seemed more deliberate and less natural compared to the qi she had sensed on the river before. It was a little stiff. Naturally, it was impossible for Zheng Xiu's cultivation to drop for no reason. To her, now was not the time to consider Zheng Xiu's cultivation. It was difficult for her to resist the power of these heavenly flames, but she had to block them. She stared at the cold heavenly flames and waved her sword again. A blue wave surged from her sword and then turned into a furious waterfall, rolling towards the sky. These dozen bolts of heavenly fire were supposed to fall at the same time towards her, and Li Yunrui at her side. This was a power she could not fight against. However, as the waterfall flowed backwards, the dozen bolts of heavenly fire broke through the waves of the green waterfall. There was a clear distinction between who came first and who came first. Then the deep green life bond sword disappeared from her hand. Her fingers flicked, and a dozen glowing droplets of liquid formed in the air to meet the dozen bolts of skyfire. Every collision was like a giant mountain colliding with each other. Countless chaotic heaven-earth yuan qi blossomed, like fireworks. More than 10 houses around the small courtyard collapsed from top to bottom, like paper. Bai Shui's face was extremely pale. She barely managed to block Zheng Xiu's skyfire. She felt proud, but at this time, she felt a warning. A black flying sword flew out from the broken tiles. This black flying sword was ordinary and did not have any unique aura. It was as ordinary as an ordinary broken tile. It did not attract any of her attention beforehand. She did not even sense it. It was not just simple, and its presence was restrained. This black flying sword had an extremely accurate grasp of timing, just like Ding Ning's winning moments at the Min Mountain Sword Trials. Even more importantly, this sword's murderousness was not directed at her, but at Li Yunrui next to her. She had no time to block with her sword. She felt very cold. There was a soft sound in the air. This was the sound of a sword passing through flesh. But this sword did not pierce Li Yunrui's body. Bai Shui's left arm was stretched out in front of Li Yunrui. This black flying sword pierced through her left arm. Then, the owner of the flying sword knew she had won the time she needed. She did not continue to fly towards Li Yunrui. Instead, she suddenly let out a shrill howl and shot straight into the sky, as though she was about to fly beyond her control. Li Yunrui glanced at Bai Shui's left arm in front of him. He looked at the terrifying wound where blood was pouring out, but his expression did not change much. He did not look at the black flying sword that was just a fraction of a breath away from killing him. He nodded at Bai Shan and said, "Let's go." As the white skyfire fell, the strong murderousness in the surrounding streets retreated like a tide. The flying swords hidden in the darkness retreated like poisonous snakes. Bai Shan knew this was because of Li Yunrui's appearance. This cultivator, who was absolutely unknown in Chongling, had not been part of this situation. No one knew that such a powerful cultivator would appear next to her. Because of the appearance of such a powerful cultivator outside of the plan, Liang Lian could not lead his army to quickly kill or capture her in these streets. The longer they fought in these streets, the more ordinary people of Chongling would die. Any old person of Chongling, including Zheng Xiu's enemies like Bai Shan, knew the cruelty of this woman sitting in the empress seat. She would not care about paying a price. But Liang Lian could not bear such a price, because the deaths of these people, these prices would not be counted on her in the future, but on Liang Lian. So at this moment, the net surrounding her and Li Yunrui loosened a little. This was a purposefully loosened gap. After they charged out, they did not know what was waiting for her and Li Yunrui outside. But as a great rebel, she did not even have the courage to try. "Let's go." She only calmly nodded her head and continued to follow behind Li Yunrui like a true attendant. Blood dripped down her arm. Then the color grew fainter. What dripped from her arm was no longer blood, but glowing water droplets. The glowing water droplets fell to the ground without any sound. They seeped through the cracks in the stone paths of Chongling's streets and alleys and into the hard earth below. Yet there was a rumbling like a drum from underground. The sound grew louder and more intense. All of Chongling started to shake. Many Qin dynasty cultivators hiding in the darkness looked in shock at the shaking ground. They could not understand how Bai Shan could cause such a result with her cultivation. Why is it like this? Li Yunrui could not understand either. He frowned slightly and could not help but ask softly. Bai Shan smiled rebelliously and said, "You have been following me. You should know that I have seen Chongling's water channels the most in these days." Underground rivers. Li Yunrui reacted. He appeared to be in a daze, but in reality, his mind was focused on his flying sword flying through the air. Causing the underground rivers to pulse is just too much of a waste of vital energy. The dust accumulated between the roof tiles fell down. Panicked voices sounded in the distant streets, followed by coughing. Lights lit up one by one. All of Chongling was awakened from their dreams. For someone like me, if I were to die, I would naturally die with a bang. How is it possible to kill me silently? Hearing Li Yunrui's words, Bai Shan lips curled into a proud smile. So what if I spend more vital energy to wake up Chongling? Li Yunrui glanced at her and did not speak. Bai Shan knew that he felt she was too conceited and arrogant at this time, but she showed an even prouder smile. "Starting now, follow me. If those two do not appear, if we can stop Zheng Xiu's sword, we may be able to leave this city alive." Li Yunrui's brow furrowed slightly. He wanted to say that leaving this city alive did not mean much to him. But sensing the tremors coming from the ground, he heard something unusual in Bai Shan words. Or rather, he heard vitality. This vitality was important to her, at least. Chapter 3:20. Dogs barked and chickens cried. All of Chongling was restless, but many people remained seated. Bureau Chief Yi Sealing of the Bureau of Astrology sat on the covered bridge at the north end of Swallowtail Alley. The river under the covered bridge was unusually restless. Transparent bubbles kept bubbling out of the mud and floated to the surface of the water. The waves splashed against the stone pillars under the covered bridge. Her expression was calm, as if she did not care at all. On the stone bridge next to her, there were open black umbrellas. The officials of the Bureau of Astrology in black robes were holding black umbrellas to cover their bodies in the darkness. They were packed together and spread from the stone bridge to the streets behind. Bai Shanshui suddenly stopped in her steps. She did not walk towards the alley ahead, and turned towards an alley to the east. Li Yunrui did not hesitate to follow her. He frowned and said, "Bureau of Astrology?" Bai Shanshui nodded. Li Yunrui looked at her proud profile and said after a moment of silence, "Why not go from there? That may be the weakest. Since Zheng Xiu has acted, and the entire Bureau of Astrology is waiting there, even if we can get out of there, what happens next will not be so simple." Bai Shanshui smiled. "If you have to risk your life, you do not have to find a person you find pleasing to the eye." After a pause, Bai Shanshui did not look at Li Yunrui and said, "In Chongling, it is very difficult to find a few pleasing to the eye." Li Yunrui shook his head. "If you really have such intentions, you should go to her. Back then, she was unable to stop you on the Wei River. Today, you are not going to pass through there. Other people may think that she is colluding with you great rebels. Her situation in Chongling will be even more difficult in the future. Back then, today, in the future." Bai Shanshui turned to look at him with slight disdain. "I just find her pleasing to the eye. Who cares about the future? I just want to be happy right now. As to whether she lives or dies, she is Qin and has nothing to do with me." Li Yunrui had never seen such reasoning and stilled. Bai Shanshui's expression suddenly grew grave. She looked into the distance. There was a towering turret in the darkness. There were no lights on the turret, but she could feel an abnormally lofty aura rising from that corner. The turret became larger and larger in her perception. "It's a Mo Shouqing." Li Yunrui also felt that strange and powerful presence. He raised his head and spoke softly in that direction. Then he turned towards the west in a very natural manner. Only that old man could emit such an aura, which was a warning to him and Bai Shanshui. If he and Bai Shanshui ignored the warning and continued to move in that direction, that abnormally high power would truly sweep down, ignoring the streets and alleys. If he tried, he would die. Thus he and Bai Shanshui could not test whether or not the old man would really attack at all costs. At this moment, if they did not want to turn back and fight to the death with Liang Lian's army, then they could only go to the west. At this time, their west was the closest path to the outskirts of Chongling, and there was a tributary of the Wei River in the outskirts. Bai Shanshui did not object and followed Li Yunrui's figure. At this time, there were no flying swords attacking. The two walked side by side, and it was impossible to see who was the other's attendant. There is a large reed marsh there. In the past, many ordinary criminals of Chongling thought they could escape easily if they ran there, but they all died there. So that reed marsh is called the Dead Marsh. Bai Shanshui gathered her messy long hair and said casually to Li Yunrui, she found that she was not used to female makeup. A very appropriate name. Li Yunrui turned to glance at her and said in an even more serious tone, "You are very beautiful right now, so I will not let you fall into their hands. If you cannot escape, I will definitely kill you before they catch you." Bai Shanshui stilled slightly and understood what he meant. If a woman like her fell into the water prison of Chongling, what she would experience would be more terrifying than a man. But she smiled unconcernedly and said, "Thank you for your praise." The ground was still shaking, and the roof tiles and beams were creaking. However, the dangerous aura they sensed was fading away, and everything became eerily quiet. No one stopped them. Like a pair of lovers watching a lantern festival, the two strolled through the streets in the night. I became a sword cultivator. In these years, only my senior sect brother followed me. I did not even have a close male friend. The atmosphere was astoundingly oppressive, but Bai Shui did not care. She looked at the dim shadows on the stone path and said casually, "In the past, if a man dared to say something like this to me, even if I did not kill him, I would have dug out his eyes." Li Yunrui frowned slightly. He felt Bai Shui was ruthless, but thinking of her previous situation and how she wanted people to feel she was powerful and dangerous, he bowed his head slightly and did not speak. But when I think of how I am about to die, and have never had a true companion, and have never understood true love between men and women, it is a pity. Bai Shui laughed again and said, "When a young girl first awakened to love, I had fantasized that if someone could disregard their life to protect me, I would disregard everything to like him. Although my senior apprentice brother has fought alongside me all these years, he is still only my senior apprentice brother. Moreover, my cultivation has always been above his. Most of the time, I am the one protecting him. Today, you are the first man to risk his life to protect me." Hearing this, Li Yunrui's breathing stopped, and his body tensed. "Since you feel I am pretty if we can charge out today and not die, we can try to start." Bai Shui pursed her lips and said naturally, "What, try to start?" Li Yunrui, who had disregarded life and death when he was in the killing formation, changed expression and shouted. He turned and saw Bai Shui's teasing smile. He was immediately annoyed and said angrily, "You are still joking with me at a time like this." Bai Shui laughed loudly without any ladylike demeanor. Many breaths later, she put away her smile and said, Bai Shui, do not go back on my words. When have you ever heard me joke?" Li Yunrui was stunned. He thought of this person's life, but could not think of anything to say in response. His face flushed red, and he forced out the word from between his teeth. "Boring." "Boring?" Bai Shui smiled soundlessly. In this life, she feared she had never been as interesting or as dangerous as today. Li Yunrui turned his head away, unwilling to speak to Bai Shui. There were no more sounds in the streets. The dead were still far away, but Bai Shui could feel the moisture coming from the reeds. A flute sounded among the reeds. Someone was playing a flute in the dead. The sound of the flute was indistinct, so slow that it was almost out of tune. It was clearly summer, but it sounded like the wailing of autumn insects, weakly flapping their wings and unable to fly up into the sky from the reed leaves that covered the sky. Yet this kind of flute had astounding penetrating power. It passed through many miles of farmland, through many streets, and clearly reached Bai Shui and Li Yunrui's ears. Li Yunrui, who had decided not to speak to Bai Shui, took a deep breath and could not help but ask coldly, "Who is it?" "Chief Inspector Chen, that mysterious warden of the Divinity Bureau." Bai Shui's words split into two brief moments. Li Yunrui heard the shock in her voice. In the next moment, Bai Shui ran her fingers through her hair and smiled. "Interesting, let's go through there." Of these people in Changling, he is the only one I have not seen fight. "You have seen the others fight?" Li Yunrui frowned and said in disbelief. "You may not believe it. Many times I did not show up, but that does not mean I was not there." Bai Shui put her hands behind her back and looked coolly at him. She said, "Do not forget, when my dynasty was destroyed, I was already a great rebel. My dynasty has been destroyed for many years, and before that, I was already on many battlefields." Li Yunrui bowed his head. Bai Shui's experiences were not something ordinary cultivators could compare to. But while mystery was interesting, it also meant unpredictability and power. If he had a choice, He would rather face another powerful woman in Chongling and her entire astrology bureau than face the mysterious chief of the bureau, who was waiting for them in the dead man's sweep. Bai Shanshui walked with her hands behind her back. He silently followed with a bowed head. Other than my senior sect brother, you are the first man who does not care about life and death, and follows me regardless of whether I am leading the way to life or death. Bai Shanshui's voice reached his ears again. Li Yunrui grew angry again, and said in a heavier tone, "So boring." "Boring?" Bai Shanshui responded coolly this time. "I just do not want you to be filled with death. If you have no interest in life, how can you help me survive?" Chapter 321. Li Yunrui turned her head away, annoyed. The faint smile on Bai Shanshui's face immediately disappeared, and she sighed, because she was more arrogant and vicious in her actions than the cultivators of the sword furnace. Even if she had not fought in Chang'e last year, she was the greatest rebel in the eyes of almost everyone in the Qin dynasty. She had become famous early and famous. Her opponent was the strongest in the world. As she grew older, she naturally developed a presence that looked down on the world. Even though her cultivation was damaged right now, and her vital energy was not as good as ordinary Realm 7 cultivators, facing her presence, many ordinary Realm 7 cultivators would cower before the battle. They would be weaker in terms of sword essence and could not match her. However, as a great grandmaster, all she had done in the past many years was either refining swords, escaping, or killing people. She drifted like duckweed and did not have many beautiful memories to reminisce about. There were also many things that she wanted to do, but did not have the time to do. She spoke so much now because she did not have much confidence that she could survive tonight. If she died here, she would have many regrets. The sound of the flute in the reed marsh was always faint, and the same when they were close. It was like the catkins in the spring, barely discernible but not clear. It made people feel uncomfortable. This patch of reeds, known as the Dead Man's Marsh, was indeed very large. It was a boundless expanse that seemed to extend to the horizon. While Chongling has a large population, the ratio of cultivators, swordsmen, and armies far surpasses any city. In other eras recorded in the history books, this is militaristic. While Yuanwu is relying on the Shang reform, the situation is stable, taxes are strict, and Guangzhong is 800 miles of fertile land. The output of each mu of land and the number of people that can be supported is much greater than other dynasties. If this balance is broken, Yuanwu will have a harder time than other dynasties. Pity that the people of the Bazin Kendo ground back, then were too strong, and we were too weak. We did not even work together once, so the 3 dynasties were destroyed so easily. Passing through the streets and alleys, they seemed to follow the guidance of the flute. No one stopped them along the way. Bai Shanshui looked at the reeds that were already in front of them and spoke calmly to Li Yunrui beside him. Li Yunrui listened to these words that were not boring to him. After a moment of silence, he said, 1/10 of the Qin dynasty died in their prime. How can this be considered easy? Although many died, there were also many who surrendered. Bai Shanshui sneered and said, 100 died, and 80 took in. When the 3 dynasties were destroyed, the Qin did not just expand their territory. Even the population of Chongling more than doubled in a few short years. Is it because men and women are fertile in Chongling? Li Yunrui was silent again. Then she said with true admiration, "Not everyone has your courage. Most people just go with the flow in the end." Neither of them turned around. However, they didn't need to turn their heads. With their cultivation, they could clearly sense that countless soldiers wearing black armor had silently surged out from the originally silent streets behind them. These soldiers in heavy armor moved nimbly. The metallic light on their bodies filled all the cracks in the streets behind them. They were like two ants in front of a black tide, but still chatting and laughing. Bai Shanshui was arrogant, but in reality, he was a very cautious person. If they had moved away some of the Chongling residents in advance, Bai Shanshui would have detected them long ago. The Qin dynasty people in the streets were a protective talisman for the two of them. Even the teacher of the Holy Son of Heaven, Mo Shoqing, whose cultivation was far above Bai Shanshui's, purposefully showed a presence on a distant turret. He acted as if he would not attack, as long as Bai Shanshui did not pass in that direction and stayed away from the ordinary people of Chongling. So according to Li Yunrui's judgment, charging out from the astrology bureau, led by Yi Siling, had been the best choice. Now that they were moving along the path the enemy had planned and away from the back streets, they did not even have the last protective talisman. If we are able to escape today, please do not misunderstand. Li Yunrui sensed the cold metal presence behind him. He hesitated for a moment, and then said solemnly, "I am just carrying out my mission." Bai Shanshui glanced at him and nodded. "You are loyal to the king's orders, but even if you seek death, you can choose who you want to die with." Li Yunrui was silent for a moment, and then slowly said, "In truth, at least, I admire you, so I hope you can live." Bai Shanshui laughed. Then she looked seriously at Li Yunrui and said, "Cultivators at your level will often be obsessed with simple and crude power. They will casually use a sword move that causes the primal energies of the universe to explode. The feeling of using absolute power to crush an opponent is hard to resist. There are very few people like you who can control your desires and cultivate such fine flying sword arts. So you are the cultivator who uses flying swords the best I have seen in recent years. In the future, I will still be your attendant." Hearing her words, Li Yunrui's expression quickly became solemn. It was not because of the meaning contained in Bai Shanshui's words, but because at this moment, the reeds in front of them were giving off dangerous presences and a unique stench. A wild wind blew out of the reeds. Then there were violent sounds. Many green reeds exploded into pieces of grass that flew into the air with the wind. Among the wild wind and debris, there were shrill screams and black shadows passed through. Li Yunrui looked up, solemnly and calmly, at the black night sky. Then the fingers of his right hand trembled slightly. There was a soft hiss. His flying sword flew out of nowhere and pierced through the oncoming wind and debris. In the next moment, there was a thick mist of blood among the wild wind and debris, and large balls of black feathers flying. A heavy black shadow fell like a meteor in front of him, and Bai Shanshui, this was a very strange bird. Its entire body was covered in black feathers like a crane. However, its body was several times larger than the largest eagle. Its eyes were blood red like beautiful rubies, and its disheveled black feathers were surrounded by an agile aura, as if there was wind flowing within it. However, the moment this strange bird fell, dozens of similar strange birds had already descended, covering the sky and covering the sun. Bai Shanshui narrowed her eyes and looked up. She was certain that the sharp claws of these birds were no less than the 100 refined swords of ordinary Chongling's swordsmen. Also, these birds gathered primal energies of the universe, and each bird was much faster than ordinary birds. Each and every one of them was like a flying sword. But she still had no intentions of attacking, and just watched silently. In a flash, fine wounds appeared on the necks of the dozens of birds. The blood turned into a mist, and the bright red flesh squeezed out of the enlarged wounds, and then revealed white bones. The dozens of birds were in extreme pain, their bodies twisting wildly in the air and spinning as they fell down. After the dozens of birds, countless black shadows flew out of the wild wind and debris. The red flashes in their eyes made the night sky seem to be filled with red gems. Bai Shanshui bowed her head. She looked at the messy ground in front of her. The sewage and mud gave off unusual vibrations. Her eyes shone brightly, and then she unhesitatingly attacked with her sword. A dark green life bond. Sword flew out. There was no waterfall of dark green sword light in front of her, and no water vapor gathered in the sky. But the sewage between the broken reeds in front of her rippled even more violently. Small scale-like waves rose up, but did not fall down. They started to give off sharp sword essences. These motionless waves were like countless sharp swords erected on the ground. Pew, 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 the sound of countless sharp blades slicing through flesh and disemboweling rang out. Many black and sticky silhouettes, whose bodies were covered in mud, were writhing on the ground in an even more painful manner than those strange birds. While they were moving swiftly, their bellies had long been cut into pieces. At this moment, their bodies were writhing madly, and their bodies were shredded into countless pieces, which were beyond recognition. Even Li Yunrui had to spend a long time to see that the figures rolling in the mud were enormous black lizard-like beasts. Their bodies were as smooth as catfish, and their skin looked tough and elastic. If they had not been moving quickly against the sharp water blades, the blades of ordinary swordsmen would not have been able to cut through their skin. When did the Qin army start to use such tactics? He shook his head in puzzlement and asked Bai Shanshui next to him, "It is not easy to cultivate these beasts. These beasts are more useful in battle. Why waste so much to deal with us?" A cold smile appeared on Bai Shanshui's face. She glanced at Li Yunrui and said, "Now I understand why Zheng Xiu forced us here." Chapter 322. Who is that young person? Mo Shouqing looked at Changling that had woken up. His wise and experienced gaze looked towards the alley that Bai Shanshui and Li Yunrui had charged out of. He gently and slowly asked a black-armored general who had just appeared behind him. The black-armored general bowed respectfully to the old man sitting on the old rattan chair. Then he reported, "The bureaus have no leads on this person." Mo Shouqing thought and said, "Try to keep him alive." The black-armored general's expression grew ugly. But if they wanted to keep a great rebel like Bai Shanshui alive, they would have to pay a great price. Adding on that young man who seemed to have fallen from the sky, and whose flying sword arts were unfathomable, who knew how many soldiers and cultivators would die tonight. But he was certain that this old man had weighed the cost when he said this. Then the price was worth it. Therefore, he solemnly bowed again and promised, "Yes, a very good flying sword, a very patient flying sword." Not many of the young people in Changling have the patience to cultivate flying swords. Mo Shouqing listened to the footsteps of the general leaving behind him and said softly to himself with pity. The turret was still trembling slightly. The rattan chair under him suddenly gave off soft cracking sounds. Old rattan chairs, old bamboo mats. The older they were, the more comfortable they would be to sit and lie down. But when they were too old, they would easily rot and break. In the past, this old rattan chair that he was used to sitting on would easily break, but this year it had broken many times. Mo Shouqing shook his head softly and felt it was inauspicious. What is the meaning? Li Yunrui turned to look at Bai Shanshui and asked. His brow was furrowed, but not because of this problem. In a situation like this where he felt he would die, he did not care about this problem. What made him uncomfortable was the pungent smell of blood and flesh from the Qin army's tamed beasts. You can't even get used to the smell of blood. It seems you have not had much experience in cruel fighting. Bai Shanshui seemed to see the source of his displeasure. He smiled mockingly, and then continued, "Many things, including battle formations and new artifacts, have to be tested in real combat after being created. The stronger the weapon, the more it has to be used against powerful cultivators. Li Yunrui quickly understood Bai Shanshui's meaning and said, "So she is using us as testing tools? A test tool like me is too hard to come by." Bai Shanshui laughed coldly and arrogantly. "She wants to send a message to me and the world with such an arrangement. Even a great rebel like me is just a tool for her to practice tactics and test new weapons in her eyes. Looks like you're right. She doesn't consider things on the same level as us at all." Li Yunrui raised her head. At this moment, the black feathers and scarlet blood that were falling from the sky suddenly thickened. The dense blood fell into the mud and even made the sound of a rainstorm. It was not because his flying sword had sped up at this moment. His flying sword was the same as Mo Shoqing's evaluation. He used the most patient fighting method. Each blow was just right and did not waste any vital energy. At this time, it was because the wild birds in the sky started to tear at each other even more furiously. Angry shouts and shouts could be heard from the distant reeds, but they could not stop the birds from rioting on their own. This kind of presence even affected the beasts in the surrounding mud. The beasts started to panic. They did not bite each other, but feared this battlefield. Some started to flee into the surrounding reeds. "I heard that Min Mountain Sword Sect has a demon farm. Zheng Xiu and Yuan will want to learn from Min Mountain Sword Sect. Zheng Xiu must feel that this is good. These animals can appear on the battlefield and show the other dynasties the new power of Chongling. But it is a pity that she is too optimistic." Bai Shanshui laughed loudly. "Have these animals never even encountered a true killing star and can only scare those mediocre people?" Li Yunrui glanced at her and shook his head. He said, "No meaning." Bai Shanshui glanced back at him and said, "Interesting, because if they can hear us, they will pass it along to Zheng Xiu's ears." Li Yunrui was silent for a moment and said, "But we will still die in the end. What is the meaning in this kind of mockery before death?" Bai Shanshui laughed with a teasing tone. "What if we can leave this place alive?" Li Yunrui did not respond to her. He looked up at the night sky and said softly, "They are here." The blackbirds that had almost covered the entire sky had already dissipated in their frenzied rampage, leaving behind countless clusters of hot, bloody aura. At this moment, the night sky was like a black curtain painted with blood, and on this curtain there were already countless gorgeous, dark green streams of light. The moment Li Yunrui said the words, these flowing lights had crossed hundreds of feet and arrived in the air above him, and Bai Shanshui, the beautiful and agile green flowing lights were like arrows. Before they could land on the ground, they began to disintegrate in midair. No primal energies of the universe reached the ground. There was only a high-frequency vibration from these broken arrows. There was an inaudible sound that covered the surroundings. Bai Shanshui's pupils contracted. Her watery eyes, an exceptionally pale face, immediately showed red light. These red lights were not caused by the flow of blood, but the rupture of many small pores. The vital energy and blood in her body, even though they flowed under her control, vibrated strangely. A wave of death energy spread from the depths of her body towards the surface of her skin. She could not resist this kind of power. She felt as though her body was about to shatter into pieces. At this time, Li Yunrui's hand landed on her shoulder. His hand also began to vibrate at an extremely high frequency. In this moment, Bai Shanshui left the shadow of death. Why is it like this? While the discomfort rippling through her body made Bai Shanshui want to vomit, she immediately took a deep breath and asked Li Yunrui. To know the solution meant that Li Yunrui knew of this terrifying weapon long ago and had a deep understanding of it. Sound Seal Arrow. Li Yunrui's expression was uglier than Bai Shanshui's. He struggled to say in a voice that only he and Bai Shanshui could hear, "My dynasty has studied this kind of weapon for decades, but we have not made any breakthroughs. This kind of seal weapon is not hard to defeat for powerful cultivators who know its principles, but for cultivators and soldiers who do not have enough vital energy, it is a disaster." Bai Shanshui frowned. She could understand Li Yunrui's feelings right now. The Chu dynasty was the strongest in weapon-making in the world and the foundation of their standing. Before Yuanwu ascended the throne, the Qin army's fighting style could be said to be based on the sword, and they fought for the world with the sword. Even after 3 years of Yuanwu, Chongling started to build workshops to make weapons, but no matter how much wealth and resources they invested, they could not compare to the workshops of the Chu dynasty. In the previous Deer Mountain Conference, the Qin dynasty had shown some powerful seal weapons to the other 3 dynasties, those arrows with flames that could melt stone, and these sound seal arrows that surpassed the Chu dynasty. It was easy to deduce a conclusion. The price Li Lingjun had paid to return to his homeland and become king was far greater than the world had imagined. He had even sold out the interests of the entire Chu dynasty. She knew that Li Yunrui was most worried about how the people of the Chu dynasty would react to the new emperor after what happened here passed back to the Chu dynasty, and what kind of turmoil would occur. This was truly killing many birds with one stone. Zhang Xiu's every move has great meaning. In terms of cunning and scheming, I think no one can compare to her. Bai Shanshui's breathing had completely stabilized. Just now, the line between life and death did not seem to affect her at all. She sneered and said, "Countless people have suffered at her hands. You do not have to worry too much about your new emperor." Li Yunrui raised an eyebrow. He did not respond. It was not because he could not detect the good intentions in Bai Shanshui's words, but because the sound of the flute that had been faintly reaching his ears had suddenly disappeared. The moment the sound of the flute stopped, a pale white sword light with an indescribable murderousness floated out of the wind. Li Yunrui's flying sword broke through the wind and met the pale white flying sword. The 2 small swords changed positions in the air, but did not truly touch each other. Then they flew back. Bai Shanshui did not look at the pale white flying sword, and calmly looked forward. Amidst the mud and reeds mixed with countless pieces of flesh, a man in dark red robes slowly appeared in her, and Li Yunrui's line of sight. Looking at this thin but uncomfortable man, Bai Shanshui said with slight disdain, "So you can use flying swords so well?" Li Yunrui's expression grew grave. The man in crimson robes was naturally the mysterious head of the Divinity Bureau. "Not from the Qin, but your flying sword is better than almost all the swordsmen in Chongling. It is not easy for you." Bai Shanshui looked at the silent Chief Inspector Chen and said disdainfully. Li Yunrui stilled and could not help but turn to look at Bai Shanshui. He usually did not travel outside, so he did not know some secrets. Chief Inspector Chen, who had been sitting in a carriage or in a dark hall all year round, so his face was unusually pale, slowly looked up. He glanced at Bai Shanshui, and then at the pale, white, flying sword that had flown back to him. He said coolly, "It is not easy, so my flying sword is called the Thin Life Sword." Hearing his voice, Li Yunrui's gaze involuntarily landed on the sword. That sword was as pale and thin as paper. Thin as paper. The name of the sword was appropriate. Chapter 323. Bai Shanshui glanced at the paper-white flying sword and said coolly to Li Yunrui, "He is yours." Li Yunrui frowned slightly, but did not say anything. She nodded slowly. A proud smile appeared on Bai Shanshui's lips. "No matter what, follow me." Then she turned. The moment she turned, countless torches lit up in the darkness, as though the entire border of Chongling facing her started to burn. In the burning sea of fire, A cultivator with a body like cast iron walked out of the crowd with firm and almost constant steps. Bai Shanshui sneered. Liang Lian, I was just about to find you. You dare to come find me? Liang Lian's expression did not change. His black boots stepped steadily on the ground. Black earth splashed out from under his feet like blooming black lotuses. The laughable pride of the Qin. Bai Shanshui looked at the silent Liang Lian and mocked even more harshly. Even if it is soldier against soldier, general against general, you do not qualify. Where is Shen Xian? Why does he not dare to come see me? Liang Lian still did not respond. He continued to walk dozens of feet with steady steps and then calmly reached out with his right hand. There was an explosion in the world. An extremely pure, life-bound items, aura filled many people's senses. A streak of black light extended outwards like an extension of his arm, forming a straight, jet-black broadsword. Half of the sword's body was thick and gloomy like the jet-black stones by the riverside, while the other half was rippling like thousands of turbid waves. He held the sword across his chest and then said coldly, "Please." Then he attacked without any hesitation. Vast amounts of primal energies of the universe flooded into his life-bond sword. A curved dam seemed to appear around his body. His body and the life-bond sword in his hand gave off more and more power, but this power kept accumulating in the riverbank. This sword was the strongest move of the cofferdam sword manual he had used against Shui Wangshu in the past, the dam-breaching sword. The essence of this sword was to continuously accumulate power, and when the dam finally broke, all the power would burst forth. In the past, when Shui Wangshu faced this sword, he used the white goat hanging horn to stop the dam from breaching. Even if it breached, he did not let the water flow towards him, but towards the two sides. Facing such a sword, Bai Shanshui smiled even more mockingly. Using such a sword move against me, you have probably forgotten that I am the Cloud Water Palace Master. She didn't attack first, but waited. Liang Lian raised his eyebrows slightly. The night clouds in the sky suddenly became chaotic, and the sword was formed. A terrible roar sounded in front of him, and the invisible dam broke. A violent and domineering force blasted out, rushing towards Bai Shanshui. Due to the backlash of the heaven and earth primordial qi, the flames on the torches of all the soldiers standing behind Liang Lian were pulled back at the same time, making whooshing noises. The power and momentum of this sword could be said to be perfect, as if it was not a power of the mortal world. But facing such a sword, Bai Shanshui didn't even draw his sword. Her left hand stroked the air. Several sparkling and translucent water droplets flew out from her fingertips like sparkling and translucent pearls, and then turned into several ribbons of sparkling and translucent water. These streams of water appeared minuscule compared to the violent wave coming from the dam. But when the two met, the violent and domineering wave could not advance, and started to spin dozens of feet in front of her. An enormous and rapidly spinning water whirlpool appeared in front of her, like a building. Many of the Chongling cultivators in the darkness were silent. Chief Inspector Chen's voice sounded at this time. The light of the fire at the border of Chongling could not reach so far. Under the light of the distant fire, this bureau chief of the Divinity Bureau, who usually did not show himself, appeared even darker and colder, but his expression still had an indescribable sense of decadence. In the past, no one in the world could surpass the Wei Cloud Water Palace in controlling water. Now, no one can surpass Palace Master Bai. He looked at Li Yunrui, who was looking at him, and said in a low but clear voice, "But have you ever thought why General Liang, who has been through hundreds of battles, would use such a sword move in front of Palace Master Bai?" Li Yunrui looked calmly at him and said, "I do not want to because that has nothing to do with me." The moment he said the first word, Two invisible sword lights flashed in the darkness between him and Chief Inspector Chen. Then a blinding spark bloomed. Two flying swords emerged from the sparks, each carrying a trembling and fluctuating air wave. If Li Yunrui was a bit distracted, or his emotions fluctuated a bit, he may be dead now. Chief Inspector Chen frowned deeply. He was certain that this unknown young person in Chongling was a rare and powerful enemy. Bai Shanshui's brow furrowed deeply as she easily resolved Liang Lian's domineering sword with her left hand. She put away her scornful and disdainful smile and said with a frown, "Even Shui Wangshu is not a match. How can you be so strong?" Liang Lian looked at the spinning whirlpool. There was no other expression on his face other than indifference. "Why do I have to appear stronger than Shui Wangshu?" Following his words, several muffled and loud explosions resounded between heaven and earth once again. The first explosion, that sounded like a landmine, came from beneath his feet. The tough black leather combat boots he wore exploded into pieces. The wet and soft soil of the reed swamp became harder and firmer than the stone roads of Chongling as his feet hammered down with the terrifying power contained in his feet. Even though his feet were like metal, as he exerted force, his flesh split and blood sprayed out. Two deep red footprints appeared under him. His body seemed to pass through space and appeared behind the spinning whirlpool. The life-bond sword in his right hand stabbed towards the spinning whirlpool, but the second muffled explosion came from his sword hilt. His left fist hammered hard on his sword hilt. A terrifying force passed through the sword hilt and into the blade. The wave seal scripts on half of his life-bond sword seemed to be sent flying and charged forward along the domineering sword essence. The third deep rumble rang out without any pause. The towering whirlpool immediately collapsed. Countless waves turned into countless swords, pressing against the air in front of them like mountains, and walls pressing towards Bai Shanshui. There were swords in front of Bai Shanshui. Tens of thousands of swords filled the sky in front of her. But the most terrifying thing was the sword that looked like a black rock with its seal scripts fading away. Tens of thousands of water swords moved through the air. The primal energies of the universe produced by the sword path all gathered into Liang Lian's sword. Bai Shanshui attacked. The long sword in her hand, which was as deep as a jade pond, also stabbed forward. The primal energies of the universe on the sword started to flow. Just a few feet forward, the tens of thousands of water swords in front of her melted like snow, turning back into glowing water and then forming a wall. A glowing water wall appeared between her and Liang Lian. Liang Lian's expression did not change. He still silently stabbed with his sword and did not change his stance. The black sword tip and the glowing water wall collided and gave off another muffled explosion. The water wall collapsed and spread outwards. The black sword tip continued to advance and then encountered Bai Shanshui's deep green sword tip. When the two sword tips met, a dot of starlight lit up like a small star was forming. Liang Lian's breathing stopped. A muffled grunt came from his tightly pressed lips. His entire body turned the color of black metal. A layer of light flashed on the surface of his skin like a sword, and then his body stopped. A circle of air exploded around his body, and the ground rippled outwards. Bai Shanshui's body flew backwards, wrapped in the wave of energy. She hit the ground hard, and then bounced into the air like a white stone. Countless cracking sounds came from behind her. The reeds swaying in the wild wind were crushed by the sword energy coming from her body. The pieces danced like snow. The moment she bounced up from the ground, Bai Shanshui had already controlled her body. While her body was still flying backwards, she maintained a standing posture. However, several strands of blood seeped out from her tightly pursed lips. Her face was pale, and her white robes were exceptionally white in the night. The lines of blood that fell on the white robes were especially eye-catching. 5 pale sword shadows circled around Li Yunrui's body like wild bees dancing in a frenzy. 5 cracks appeared on Li Yunrui's robes. Faint lines of blood seeped out of the cracks. "So you are so strong." Bureau Chief Chen still had a strange sense of decadence as he looked up slightly and said, no one knew if he was speaking to Li Yunrui, who had managed to block this attack and only suffered some flesh wounds, or to Liang Lian, who had sent Bai Shanshui flying with one blow. Even as he spoke, Liang Lian still held his sword coldly and looked at Bai Shanshui in the air, looking at his back that was as cold as iron. All the soldiers behind him woke up from their shock. They finally understood why their general had been so cold and unchanged after losing to Shui Wangshu. They also finally understood why this general had not been outstanding among his former colleagues, but had been able to survive several battles where only a few people had survived. Because he was willing to lose. The same 2 swords showed completely different power. General Liang was stronger than many people had imagined. Chapter 324. Bai Shanshui landed on the ground again. With the terrifying impact, her feet plowed out 2 deep gullies in the muddy ground. Her right sleeve was completely torn. Blood and energy wrapped around her jade-white arm, burning like a bright red flame. She looked up and started to cough. Blood seeped out of the corners of her bright lips, but her expression grew colder. "You have won this blow. If this was any other time, I would admit defeat. But tonight we are not competing, but deciding life and death." When this voice sounded, the ground under her feet suddenly sank silently, forming a perfect circular pit. Then her figure disappeared from it. She started to run towards Liang Lian. Perfect circular pits continuously appeared in the ground. Anyone could imagine the terrifying power contained in them. Yet there was no sound. Countless fine lines of water seeped out of the earth and flew up under the pressure of the great power. It started to rain in the space Bai Shanshui passed through. Yet this rain came from the ground to the sky, filled with a heaven-defying presence. Li Yunrui looked up and calmly looked at the dispirited chief inspector in the darkness ahead. He asked seriously, "You want to die with me?" At the same time, the flying sword in front of him started to accelerate. A straight sword path appeared in the air between him and Chief Inspector Chen. His flying sword flew in a straight path towards Chief Inspector Chen's throat. Before this, his flying sword had always been on an erratic path, making it hard for people to catch its trajectory. Now, it was flying in a straight line. Everyone found that his flying sword was very fast. Sensing the sword essence of this blow, Chief Inspector Chen narrowed his eyes slightly. However, he did not call back his flying sword. As his right hand moved slightly, his flying sword also flew straight forward, brushing past Li Yunrui's flying sword, and also pointed straight at Li Yunrui's throat. In this moment, an old figure appeared from the reeds behind him. He drew his sword, and a gray sword light with a moldy presence slashed towards Li Yunrui's flying sword. This was not a sword competition, but a life and death battle. So at certain moments, Chief Inspector Chen did not need to rely on his own power to deal with Li Yunrui's flying sword. He also had attendants, and his attendants were more powerful than ordinary attendants. Liang Lian's eyes narrowed into thin lines. Looking at Bai Shanshui charging at him at a terrifying speed, he could not understand. But he did not hesitate. His chiseled brows slowly rose. Then he raised his life-bond sword to its limit and smashed it down towards the string of afterimages of Bai Shanshui. There was a muffled boom. Although it was a sword move, it smashed towards Bai Shanshui like a giant stick covering the sky. all the afterimages disappeared. The rain that flew up into the sky was instantly destroyed by the enormous power. Bai Shanshui's figure appeared. Her robes were pulled back to the extreme, and her proud figure could be seen at a glance. Her sword that was slashing towards Liang Lian was forcefully smashed to the ground, and her body was also forcefully smashed to the ground, retreating backwards. A trace of coldness appeared in Liang Lian's eyes. He calmly took a step forward and raised the sword in his hand again. However, it was also at this moment that his pupils rapidly contracted. Bai Shanshui retreated 10 steps. Each step she took landed in the perfect circular pit she had made previously. With every step he took, a white spray sprayed out from every pit. The 10 white waves charged towards Liang Lian. Liang Lian shouted and brought his sword down horizontally. The 10 white waves overlapped and hit the sword light in front of him. The 10 enormous powers overlapped and vibrated from the sword to his body. Liang Lian's body flashed with black metal light. But when the 7th great power hit his sword, he could not withstand it. With a grunt, his body flew backwards. Before his body landed on the ground, he spat out a mouthful of blood. The gray sword light that gave off a moldy presence accurately hit Li Yunrui's flying sword. But in this moment, Li Yunrui's flying sword split into 2. The 2 flying swords seemed to be alive as they sliced towards the arteries on the sides of Chief Inspector Chen's neck. An incredulous shout came out of the old figure's mouth. The gray sword light brought along a series of afterimages, wanting to cut down the 2 flying swords in one fell swoop. However, with a clang, this gray sword light was only able to knock away one of the flying swords before it was jolted into the air. On the other hand, the other flying sword seemed to be infused with even more power as it moved forward at an even faster speed. Chief Inspector Chen's body flew to the side. When Li Yunrui's flying sword naturally split into 2, his body had already flown to the side. At the same time, the flying sword flying towards Li Yunrui gave off a shrill howl and circled back with a wild presence. But both the body's movement and the sword's return could not keep up with the speed of Li Yunrui's flying sword. In a fraction of a second, the cold presence coming off the flying sword touched Chief Inspector Chen's skin and seeped into the arteries under his skin. Seeing that it was impossible to block such a sword, Chief Inspector Chen's face turned ashen. But there was no terror in his eyes. His pupils became absolutely empty. His long hair danced on the flying sword. His broken hair scattered. The flying sword still flew forward. The primal energies of the universe dancing between the broken hair bought Chief Inspector Chen a moment. His body straightened slightly, and then he used his collarbone to meet the flying sword. His body was thin, and his collarbone was like a long and narrow blade. With a crack, his collarbone broke. The flying sword flew up and still wanted to cut the arteries in his neck. But at this time, his wild flying sword finally arrived. In this moment, the tip of the sword brushed against the tail of Li Yunrui's flying sword. A blast of energy and blue flames bloomed. Li Yunrui's flying sword bent down and left another bone-deep wound on Chief Inspector Chen's left shoulder. The old attendant with the gray sword light roared madly and swung his sword again. Li Yunrui's flying sword had already burrowed into the earth below. In an instant, it rushed out with a cloud of mud dozens of feet away. His hair was cut, his collarbone was broken, and his shoulder was wounded to the bone. Chief Inspector Chen was covered in blood, and his presence was weak. Li Yunrui did not look pleased after seriously injuring the mysterious bureau chief whose status was above the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. The remaining half of his sword flew back with him. At this time, Bai Shanshui was charging towards Liang Lian again. Blood seeped out of her body due to the violent vibrations. Bloody clouds shrouded her, but a perfect pit appeared under her feet again. At this time, Chief Inspector Chen and Liang Lian were both seriously injured. Theoretically, Bai Shanshui should have turned around and charged out with Li Yunrui from Chief Inspector Chen's side. Liang Lian still had an army behind him and many powerful Chongling swordsmen. Even if they could kill Liang Lian, even if they could charge past the army, they would just charge back into Chongling. What was the meaning? Li Yunrui still could not understand Bai Shanshui's actions, but he remembered that Bai Shanshui had told him to follow her. He chose to trust her. His body rapidly flew backwards and chased after Bai Shanshui's afterimage. Cries of surprise rang out like a tidal wave. No one had expected that General Liang and the mysterious bureau chief, who had just displayed strength far beyond what they had shown in the past, would be defeated at the same time in an instant. Liang Lian took a deep breath. His body seemed to fill up. The long sword in his hand rose like a crowbar and hit Bai Shanshui's falling lifebond sword. There was an indescribable dull sound in the world. It was like there was a divine warrior driving a stake. Liang Lian was unable to move Bai Shanshui's sword. His long sword was still in an upward position, but his metal body was nailed into the ground by Shanshui's sword. Waves of mud rose around Liang Lian's body. In this moment, Liang Lian's body was cut into the ground. Only his head and his right hand that was holding the sword remained above the ground. His body had been much larger than Bai Shanshui, but at this time, Bai Shanshui stood in front of him and was many times taller. Bai Shanshui coughed up some bloody foam. A cold smile once again appeared on her face. Her sword retracted a bit along with the shock wave, and then she swung it down again steadily. More shocked gasps sounded in the distance. Everyone could see that Liang Lian could not withstand her attack. No one in the surroundings could stop Bai Shanshui's attack. Also, there was a flying sword that was close to Bai Shanshui. Li Yunrui's figure was only 100 feet away from Bai Shanshui. His flying sword was at his side. Finally here. But at this time, Bai Shanshui raised her head. She seemed to be speaking to Li Yunrui, but also seemed to be talking to herself. Li Yunrui looked up. There were some pale flowing flames in the sky. These pale streams of fire seemed to be exactly the same as the ones that had appeared above the alley. But for some reason, these pale streams of fire that were not dazzling made it difficult for him to open his eyes. Chapter 325. In the serene imperial palace, the Empress' feet left the ground. Her perfect body emitted countless cold and pure rays of light, which passed through the holy light in the courtyard and into the endless starry sky. Her face was absolutely indifferent, a kind of indifference that did not carry any joy of the world. On the outskirts of Chongling, the pale streams of fire falling from the sky were extremely cold and cruel. Many cultivators in Chongling, especially those who had experienced the bloody coup a dozen years ago, felt this absolute cold presence that had not appeared for a long time and couldn't help but tremble. Bai Shanshui looked up at the streams of fire. All the reeds around her that had not been destroyed in the previous battle snapped and fell to the ground. It was as if there were countless small invisible hammers smashing down on the ground, causing layers of dust to explode. Time seemed to stop flowing at this moment. The green sword in her hand was just a few feet away from Liang Lian. The pale streams of fire looked very far away, but in everyone's perception, these streams of fire were quickly approaching Bai Shanshui and Liang Lian's bodies. Li Yunrui felt awe. This was awe towards power and sword essence. These pale streams of fire contained the most cold sword essence, like it could sever all emotions in the world. It was so pure and perfect that it had a kind of divine light. Any sword essence, when extreme, meant power. This sword was out of the world, almost like the will of the heavens. Everyone knew that the mistress of Changling was strong and had never been defeated. But when he saw this sword essence tonight, he understood that the other was stronger than he had imagined. What else could he do? If this was what Bai Shanshui was waiting for, then what was Bai Shanshui waiting for? Li Yunrui closed his eyes and did not look at the extremely cold sword essence. His flying sword carried a peaceful presence of waiting for the final judgment as it continued to circle around him and Bai Shanshui. At this moment, he subconsciously thought that if he really died here with this great rebel, it wouldn't be too bad. Bai Shanshui's body started to tremble violently under the pressure of the cold sword essence. Pain appeared on her pale face, but her eyes flashed with even more arrogance and fanaticism. Her sword no longer fell towards Liang Lian's head, but instead swung upwards. A green heavenly river formed above her body and welcomed the pale flames that were filled with divine radiance. Even though this thick green, celestial river gave off an indescribable arrogance, it was just a mortal presence. It could not compare to the perfect sword essence falling from the sky. In the perception of all the Changling cultivators in the distance, Bai Shanshui, who was seriously injured, could not stop such a perfect attack. Yet in this moment, Chief Inspector Chen, who had not changed expression even when his collarbone was cut and his aorta almost severed, suddenly changed expression. He gave a howl like never before. The flying sword hanging in front of him suddenly lit up like a star and rushed towards Bai Shanshui. No one could understand Chief Inspector Chen's panic, and no one had the time to do anything. The pale, flowing fire had already fallen to the ground. Countless people were horrified. Just as these pale white streams of fire fell to the ground, it was as if a bright world had been born beneath the ground. Countless cracks appeared on the ground, and pale white and cold divine radiance also surged out of the cracks. This scene only stayed in everyone's eyes for a moment. Then the ground exploded, as an enormous ball of light rose from the ground. Countless pieces of shattered land flew up. Everyone saw Liang Lian's body fly out along with the pieces of shattered land. His body emitted a dazzling black iron flame, but compared to the pale white light below him, it was exceptionally dim. It was so faint that it was like an inconspicuous shadow. Chief Inspector Chen's flying sword reached the edge of the ball of light, but was stopped by the expanding presence. It clearly slowed down. Compared to the previous rapid battle, everything seemed to be in slow motion. Just the remaining power was enough to make the flying sword of a Realm 7 cultivator difficult to pass. But at this time, Bai Shanshui was still standing, causing many people to stop breathing. Bai Shanshui's body was also flying up, but she stood firmly on a piece of land that was flying up. Her figure was very steady. She was dressed in white robes. Under the light of the pale, white ball of light under her feet, she did not dim, but appeared even more dazzling. Then everyone saw the light of water. Countless glowing streams of water appeared under the pale white ball of light. Li Yunrui's body was nailed to the ground under his feet like a nail. That half of the thin sword piece still stubbornly danced around him, and Bai Shanshui. In this moment, he and Bai Shanshui exchanged a look. He understood what Bai Shanshui was waiting for. At this time, the tremors in Changling had completely stopped. All the tremors seemed to have found an outlet, and the outlet was under their feet. The Wei Cloud Water Palace was the best in the world in controlling water. Bai Shanshui had told him that the tremors came from the Yin River under Changling. The Yin River was a waterway, but these rivers were deep underground. Only when they were completely flowing could Bai Shanshui sense the flow of the Yin River and find a suitable exit before her vital energy ran out. Even more importantly, she had to have great power to help her open a passage. to capture a cultivator of her level alive, there had to be a power stronger than her. So she had been waiting for Zheng Xiu's true power. So she had disregarded the damage to her body and used such a method to fight Liang Lian. The perfect pit, the rain that flew up against the sky, the gushing spring that attacked Liang Lian, and the life-bond sword attack were all setting up this final situation. Zheng Xiu did not want to kill her directly. Therefore, even though her last sword strike was filled with a fervent and untamed aura, it was actually a very gentle sword strike. Water was originally soft. Her attack was not meant to be a defense, but to use the softest sword move to protect herself. In this moment, Chief Inspector Chen sensed her sword essence, but it was still too late. Shouts sounded from the distant reeds, but the path to survival had appeared. Who could stop Bai Shanshui's serpent from returning to the sea? Glowing water surged out of the ground. The cold and pale ball of light dyed the world and became weak and powerless. Then it collapsed into shadows and started to disappear. Beneath Bai Shanshui, there was the sound of an army galloping. Waves of energy charged out, and in the end, it was like a breath was exhaled and exhausted. The thousands of streams of water gathered into one place, turning into an unimaginably thick pillar of water that charged into the sky. Li Yunrui's gaze passed Bai Shanshui's figure to the distant line of fire, looking at the Qin dynasty army that paled under the torches. He felt heartfelt respect for this white-robed woman. But at this time, his usual calmness disappeared. His expression changed dramatically. He shouted at Bai Shanshui, "Careful!" A dark green shadow appeared in the enormous pillar of water under Bai Shanshui's feet. The moment Li Yunrui spoke, there was a strange sound. This shadow grew furiously like an enormous water plant. A terrifying wave of energy appeared in the enormous pillar of water and was about to split the entire pillar of water apart. Bai Shanshui's heart sank to the extreme, and her body turned cold. She was familiar with the presences coming from under her feet. That sword belonged to Lian Bo, one of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty, and the person holding the sword was the master of the great floating water prison, Shen Xian. These two were skilled in water, and were the opponents she feared the most in Chongling. From the start of this ambush, she had been most worried about the appearance of these two people. Yet she had never expected them to appear in such a way at this time. Had that perfect woman in the imperial palace guessed her intentions when Chongling started to tremble and arranged for such a move? Or had Shen Xian, who was familiar with Chongling's water, assassinated her in such a way? Bai Shanshui could not guess. She only felt endless anger. Icy anger surged out of her heart and spread to every part of her body. Her power was used up. Don't! However, at this moment, her body shook violently again, and she let out a fierce roar. A thin sword light with a fearless aura passed through the waves and clashed with the dark green sword light that was growing wildly like seaweed. There was a muffled bang. The wind and waves rose. The thin sword was sent flying by the scattering waves. This flying sword could not stop Shen Xian's attack that had been prepared for a long time. Li Yunrui also knew that his attack could not stop Shen Xian. Go! He glanced at the howling Bai Shanshui. The moment he spoke, he threw his body out like a sword. His body moved like a sword and stood in front of the green sword light. Bai Shanshui was silent. The inky green sword light passed through Li Yunrui's body. The glowing water behind him turned bright red, but his panicked expression became unusually calm. Go! He opened his mouth. Bai Shanshui could not hear his voice, but she could clearly see the shape of his mouth. Boom! Thousands of waves instantly engulfed the figures of these people. Chapter 326. The night was as calm as water, and a faint dawn appeared on the horizon. All of Chongling was quiet. Mo Shouqing, sitting on the rattan chair in a thin blanket, seemed to have fallen asleep. But when he heard footsteps behind him, he slowly opened his eyes. The stern general, who had been ordered to leave, appeared behind him with an ugly expression. He bowed and said in a cold voice, "By Shanshui escaped, and that nameless cultivator was captured by Xinxian." Mo Shouqing stilled slightly, shock in his dim yellow eyes. He said to himself, "He still left." The stern general took a deep breath, controlled his emotions, and nodded. He said gravely, "Bureau Chief Huang sent news that the Min Mountain Sword trials have ended. The winner is Shui, Wangshu's disciple, Ding Ning." Mo Shouqing stilled again. The stern general bowed and left without another word. Mo Shouqing bowed his head in silence for a moment. The breeze at dawn blew at his ginseng-like hair, and then an emotional expression appeared at the corners of his mouth. The identity of that powerful and nameless young cultivator was worth investigating, but he knew that the Empress had mobilized tonight for the lonely mountain sword horde and to keep by Shanshui. Now, it was this nameless cultivator who had stayed. While he had not seen the scene with his own eyes, he could imagine how such a situation had occurred. Coincidentally, that wine shop youth had won first place in the Min Mountain Sword trials. The Empress, who had never been defeated before, had lost twice in a row tonight. Thinking back to the perfect coldness of that sword essence, thinking about how Bai Shanshui and the wine shop youth had won, the old city guard couldn't help but sigh again. He sighed at the Empress' defeat tonight, her coldness losing to burning emotions. On Min Mountain, the sky was slightly bright, but as the sky gradually brightened, the tallest peak that looked like an indigo sword that was going to pierce a hole in the sky gradually faded and disappeared from the sight of everyone outside the mountain. In front of the cliff, at the highest point of the mountain, Bailey Sushue stood silently like an even colder cliff. Looking at Bailey Sushue, who was looking coldly in the direction of Chongling, Jing Liuli's brows furrowed even tighter. He finally could not help but say, "What happened?" Chongling shakes, Starfire falls. Bailey Sushue raised his head and said with slight scorn, "Only the lonely mountain sword horde can make Zheng Xiu act like this." Jing Liuli's expression turned cold. After a moment of silence, she narrowed her eyes and said, "The Emperor has reached Realm 8. If Zheng Xiu also obtains the lonely mountain sword horde, we will have the worry of the Bazin Kendo ground." Bailey Sushue shook his head and sneered, "The present is different from the past. How can it be so easy?" In the past, Zheng Xiu and Yuanwu had to work together to defeat their greatest enemy, and now their greatest enemy was himself. People like them love themselves the most in this world. How can their feelings for others be more intense than their feelings for themselves? At most, it's just a matter of weighing the benefits. Don't make me believe that the two of them are one and have an intimate relationship. The Qin dynasty has 2 ministers, 13 marquises, and the 2 bureau chiefs. There seem to be countless experts, but even at the Deer Mount Conference and tonight, how many can fight? Donghu, Yuezhi, Western Chang, while they are called vassal countries and appear to be harmonious, why do they waste 3 armies and 3 marquises to station there? Outside of Liaodong and behind Yin Mountain, when has it ever been peaceful? After a pause, Bailey Sushue glanced at Jing Liuli, who was deep in thought, and said, "Does Yuanwu dare to put less Realm 7s in the Chu and Qi regions?" Jing Liuli frowned in thought and nodded slightly. In the past, Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu feared that their lives would be in the hands of others and spared no expense. Is the glory of the Deer Mountain Conference not Yuanwu's glory alone? If not for Yuanwu, a Realm 8, could the Qin dynasty have gained anything at the Deer Mountain Conference? Bailey Sushue said with thick disdain, This great show looks lively and beautiful, but thinking about it, how can it compare to when Ba Mountain Sword Field was the strongest? How can it have the glory of that time? In the past, even if there were more people like Bai Shanshui, would they dare to enter Changling? Jing Liuli's frown slowly relaxed. At this time, Bailey Sushue added coldly, she may not be able to comprehend the lonely mountain sword horde. Even if she does, so what? Jing Liuli looked up in shock. Bailey Sushue's previous words were not hard to understand, but she felt that these words were hard to understand. Min Mountain Sword Sect does not only have you, but also Ding Ning. Bailey Sushue glanced at her and said with apparent displeasure. Jing Liuli stilled and immediately understood her master's meaning. She did not feel any terror or unease, nodding and saying, yes. The conversation between the current sect master of Min Mountain Sword Sect and the next sect master finished. Jing Liuli turned, but as she moved, her figure suddenly stopped. She turned to look at Bailey Sushue and said seriously, Master, do you really think that person leaving behind an heir is nonsense? This was clearly a question the two had discussed. Bailey Sushue's eyebrows rose, a layer of frost appearing on his face. He said, I saw that person die with my own eyes. What problem can there be? The 9-death silkworm is so profound. Even with personal teaching, one may not be able to comprehend and cultivate it. How can someone learn without a teacher and cultivate the 9-death silkworm to a certain level? Jing Liuli sensed Bailey Sushue's deep displeasure and immediately bowed slightly in apology. Bailey Sushue's expression recovered its calm. He said softly in disdain, there are no ghosts in the world, only ghosts in people's hearts. Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu have done so many things. It is normal to be afraid of certain things happening. Jing Liuli did not speak more. The hint of doubt in her heart was wiped away by her master's words. Her footsteps grew lighter as she left. The sun suddenly appeared. The golden light started to smear the mountains and dyed the edges of her body gold. Bailey Sushue did not turn around. He looked up at the golden light at the Changling city that appeared in the world and laughed disdainfully. You say you have never lost, but that is because the strongest people were on your side in the past, and the opponents you encountered later were not qualified and strong enough. Even the person who will not lose lost, who will not lose. The calm way river flashed with light under the morning sun. A white figure slowly floated up from the bottom of the water. With the gentle slap of the waves, it was washed to the roots of the old willows on the shore. As it floated up, it was gradually bound by the water grasses and the roots of the old willows, as though these water grasses and roots were going to absorb nutrients and merge into one. The heat of the sun caused this white figure to move slightly. Bai Shanshui woke up. She saw her situation. Out of the corner of her eye, she could even see the merchant ships and the armored ships of the Qin dynasty passing by. Her cultivation was high, but she still felt weak at this moment. Her vital energy and blood were terrifyingly empty. Her skin was as pale as a floating corpse. Yet she did not move at all. She just lay in the water and looked at the sky through the cracks in the tree roots. The sky was still the same sky. However, many things had changed. Li Yunrui should have come to kill her, but in the end, she saved her. Even more importantly, she knew Li Yunrui would not die. It would be good if she died. But Changling had the great floating water prison, the most terrifying thing for cultivators. Li Yunrui had landed in the hands of the master of the great floating water prison, Shen Xian. She was also the victor against Zheng Xiu on that night that had just passed away. She had successfully taken the lonely mountain sword horde and escaped Changling, and was certain she could survive. But unlike Bailey Sushue right now, she did not have a happy mood. Chapter 3:27. What was truly heartless was time. Sunlight shone over Chongling, gilding each dilapidated courtyard with a layer of gold. Most of the people of Chongling started to hear that the shock last night came from the great rebel who had once sung wildly in Chongling. They slowly calmed down from their panic in the middle of the night. At this time, the news of the Min Mountain Sword trials started to spread through Chongling. Countless gasps of disbelief and praise sounded in different corners of Chongling at different times. On this day, the name Ding Ning was heard in Chongling much more often than by Shanshui. This ordinary youth, who had been in Falling Parasol last year, had miraculously become the winner of the Min Mountain Sword trials. This was too legendary. His birth excited the people of Chongling even more. The formerly quiet Falling Parasol was filled with people. Countless carriages and horses even blocked the main road outside. Many people had come to see how this shabby alley was different from the other alleys and how it had raised such a monster. Before this, in Chongling, in the entire Qin dynasty, there were only two true monsters, Jinglioli and Anbaosher. But now, all of Chongling, and soon all of the Qin dynasty, and the world knew that there was another Ding Ning. The streets and alleys were noisy and restless, but the wine shop with its doors tightly locked was still cold and quiet. The ground was covered in thick dust from last night's shock. Amidst the sounds of people approaching the door and the heated breaths, the dust in the hall floated and dimmed everything inside. In the bedroom in the inner courtyard, Zhang Sun Qianxue sat silently on the edge of the bed, her long eyelashes fluttering. Even though the news of Ding Ning's victory had come, she did not know if Bai Shanshui was alive or dead. She did not know if Bai Shanshui's movements last night would cause fatal danger to her. If Ding Ning did not return here, she could not be at ease. In the cold and lonely imperial palace, the empress, who had not slept last night, still looked so perfect. She showed no tiredness and no emotions different from usual. She wrote a letter herself and then casually handed it to a palace attendant standing next to her. She said calmly, "Have someone bring it to Zhang Yi. I heard that two powerful flying swords appeared in the outskirts of Chongling last night. One sword could stop dozens of mortal-grade flying swords. How do they compare to you? He broke through to the fourth realm and defeated a cultivator of the fifth realm. Do you think I can defeat him in the future?" A handsome young man in ordinary hemp clothes was speaking. He was standing on the edge of a precipice. In front of him, there was only a thin layer of clouds and mist. There was only a small, pale yellow sword without a handle floating in front of him. It trembled slightly with his breathing. The aura on the sword had a wonderful rhythm, as if it had a unique life of its own. There was no one else around, so he was talking to his flying sword. Judging from the way he spoke, it was not a whim, but a habit of talking to his flying sword. Even if a flying sword seemed to be alive, it was still a dead object that could not open its mouth. Talking to one's own flying sword would often make one feel very lonely. However, true geniuses were often lonely. The sunlight fell all over Chongling, but there were still many corners of Chongling that could not see the sun. Under the canopy that covered the sky, in the ghostly fish market, there was the sound of a zither. Multiple stalks of black bamboo swayed by the shady doorsill. In reality, the Empress coldness is not just about using someone else to kill. The red-clothed lady, who had a gentle face and an extremely gentle tone, lowered her head slightly. She softly said to the stooped black-clothed old man, "The thing that she is the coldest and best at doing is to separate the people you care about from your side one by one." After this night, some people in Chongling were happy, some were sad, and some had just woken up. Xie Changsheng struggled to open his eyes. He felt the world outside was blinding, and then he felt the heat. Then he understood that this was the sunlight blinding him. He was certain he was alive. Then he could not help but laugh. He did not have much strength, but he used all his strength to laugh. As expected, Min Mountain Sword Sect did not watch him die. He was still alive. This was his victory. You dare to laugh so loudly with such serious wounds. You do not fear your wounds rupturing. A disdainful voice reached his ears. Xie Changsheng had not even seen the surroundings, and naturally did not see the speaker. But he said unconcernedly, "I will not die if my wounds rupture." The person who spoke was stunned, as if he couldn't refute his words. Xie Changsheng blinked his eyes proudly, and slowly saw that he was in a green house. The ground and walls were blue, but not pure blue jade, so he could not help but smile in disdain. He said, "Blue jade is the path, blue jade is the hall. I thought that Min Mountain Sword Sect was extremely rich, so it is just the decorations on the outside, and the inside is just blue stone of similar color. Rich is rich. You look at everything with the aura of a copper coin." Hearing the even more disdainful voice, Xie Changsheng managed to turn his head and stilled. He saw a young woman in blue robes standing in the doorway looking coldly at him. Then he immediately recalled that this young woman in blue robes was Jing Liuli, who had made him feel inferior. Strange. He couldn't help but mutter after a moment of daze. Jing Liuli glanced at him and said, "What is strange?" Xie Changsheng hesitated and said, "Honestly, I seem to have been very afraid of you before, but now I do not seem to be afraid." Jing Liuli frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Xie Changsheng laughed. "It should be that I have already died once. What is there to be afraid of? Also, in my opinion, I made a bet with Min Mountain Sword Sect that they would not let me die. Now that I have won against all of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Of course, I will not fear you, a genius of Min Mountain Sword Sect." Jing Liuli showed a disdainful smile and turned around. A foolish, self-comforting thought. Xie Changsheng was not angry. Looking at her back, he suddenly thought of an important matter and shouted, "The Min Mountain Sword trials have ended." Jing Liuli's steps paused slightly. "It has ended." Xie Changsheng's body stiffened slightly. "Who is first?" Jing Liuli said without looking back. "Ding Ning." Xie Changsheng was stunned. Ha 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 ha. In the next moment, he once again used all the strength he could muster to laugh out loud. Jing Liuli did not look back. Her brow furrowed deeply again. Facing such a foolish and reckless Guanzhong disciple, she did not even have a reason to be angry. Almost at the same time, there were people waking up in Changling. Liang Lian was waking up. In fact, he wasn't really unconscious. It was just that the limitless sword body that he cultivated had a unique sword nurturing technique. When others seemed to be unconscious, he could use this technique to suppress and heal the injuries in his body. At this moment, there was not enough time to heal his injuries. He should be unconscious for a longer period of time. Yet he knew he had to wake up early. Even if he had many hidden wounds that were hard to heal, he had to wake up early. Amidst the flapping of the war banners, he woke up in the tent of the Middle Army and opened his eyes. But unlike usual, there was not even a soldier holding a sword in the Middle Army tent, or even at the door. Almost at the same time, in a room not far from Xie Changsheng, Ding Ning also woke up. Chapter 3:28. You woke up at least 8 hours earlier than I expected. When Ding Ning woke up, an ordinary voice reached his ears. The person who spoke had an ordinary appearance, so ordinary that he would not attract attention on the streets. It was just that he had an illustrious or even frightening past. He was one of the strongest people in Min Mountain Sword Sect, human chef Gung Ren. Ding Ning slowly turned his head and looked at Gung Ren standing by his bed. He did not have much of an expression and said seriously, "Many thanks." Gung Ren nodded in return and said, "You are welcome. You can call me Sect Uncle in the future." Ding Ning nodded and said, "Sect Uncle." Gung Ren smiled slightly and pointed to the left side of Ding Ning's bed. Normally, reading with serious wounds hurts the mind the most. But you are not an ordinary person, so you can read this first. There was a thin book on the left side of Ding Ning's bed. It was an ordinary silk page. While it was clearly a handwritten copy, and not a rare ancient book, if any other cultivator in Chongling saw the name on this thin book, they would be shocked. 7 Books of Cultivation. Ding Ning saw the name on the cover of this book, but he did not show the joy that Gung Ren had imagined. He thought for a moment, and then looked at Gung Ren. "I want to return to Chongling first." Gung Ren looked in surprise at Ding Ning. He thought that Ding Ning might know what kind of sutra this was, so he explained gently, "These 7 books of cultivation are the introductory body cultivation method of Min Mountain Sword Sect. It is equivalent to the Min Mountain Sword Sect's vital energy cultivation method. The most profound cultivation methods of Min Mountain Sword Sect are based on the meridians of this sutra." Ding Ning shook his head and said, "I know what sutra this is. I also know that the 7 books of cultivation are one of the secret sutras of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Even in Min Mountain Sword Sect, only a portion of the disciples have the opportunity to study and come into contact with the secret sutras that truly represent the essence of Min Mountain Sword Sect." Gung Ren was even more surprised. He did not ask why Ding Ning wanted to return to Chongling first. He looked seriously into Ding Ning's eyes and said, "You should know that you do not have much time. All of Chongling is shocked because you won, but your victory has caused them to temporarily overlook a fact." After a pause, Gung Ren said gently, "For other people, winning first in the Min Mountain Sword trials means a bright future. But they overlook that your energies are too strong. You have to hurry." Ding Ning looked calmly at him and said, "I know." Gung Ren nodded and said patiently, "I know that with your comprehension, you may be able to quickly comprehend a sutra like this. But there are some things you may not know. Some of the cultivation methods of Min Mountain Sword Sect are not like ordinary methods, or rather, they are too different." Ding Ning looked at him and did not respond. Gung Ren also looked at him and then slowly said, "Min Mountain Sword Sect has some methods that other sects cannot match, and we have accumulated some things that ordinary cultivation places do not have. But there are some things that a person's strength is limited, and not everything is omnipotent. With your current physical condition, there is only one way to solve this problem." Ding Ning naturally knew which method he was speaking of. This method was even more important to him than the legendary Lonely Mountain Sword Horde. So even though he had guessed that Gung Ren was going to speak of this method, when he heard Gung Ren speak of it, his breathing grew disorderly, and his body started to tremble uncontrollably. Gung Ren looked at Ding Ning's eyes and said in a more serious tone, "This method is unique in that it creates another energy sea. The effect of that energy sea is like the organs in the body and can even replace some of the effects of our organs. But it is not just difficult to comprehend. The cultivation method must also connect many meridian points. Connecting each meridian point requires time. Min Mountain Sword Sect originally had very few people who comprehended and chose to cultivate this method." Gung Ren grimaced and then said, "Even more importantly, not every Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator with enough talent can choose to cultivate this method. There are 9 levels of the Sword Pagoda. One must make enough contributions to Min Mountain Sword Sect for each level." Ding Ning took a deep breath and said, "Since this method is so important, it should be in the highest level of the Min Mountain Sword Sect's Sword Pagoda. So one must make great contributions to Min Mountain Sword Sect in order to see it." Gungren nodded. Ding Ning muttered, "Can't we make an exception? This is the rule of Min Mountain Sword Sect." Gungren said with a grimace, "In Min Mountain Sword Sect, what cannot be broken is called a rule. Everyone obeys the rules. Min Mountain Sword Sect is much stronger than Chongling," Ding Ning said after a moment of silence. Gungren thought that Ding Ning had such emotions because of White Goat Cave's experiences. He did not comment and said, "Since you know this, you should hurry." Ding Ning glanced at the records by his ear and then at Gungren. He said, "If possible, Sect Uncle, please prepare a carriage for me. I will start reading from the carriage." Gungren stilled and then nodded. He said, "Your status is different from the past. Since you have decided to return to Chongling, you need to prepare more than just a carriage." Liang Lien slowly sat up on the bed. His breathing had already stabilized not long after he woke up. However, as his expression became cold again, his breathing deliberately became disorderly. Then he coughed violently and spat out blood. Footsteps sounded. A vice general in black armor pushed open the curtain and entered. Liang Lien looked at this vice general who should have been waiting outside the tent. His gaze did not change much. He waved his hand and said, "Have the strategists come over?" This vice general bowed his head slightly, his eyes flashing as he acknowledged, and retreated. Moments later, the tent opened again. The sound of the war banners flapping in the wind grew louder inside the tent. Chi Pumo, dressed in black robes, appeared in front of Liang Lien. Liang Lien stopped coughing and looked indifferently at Chi Pumo. He said, "How are the other two?" Chi Pumo bowed respectfully and said, "The nameless cultivator has entered the great floating water prison. Bai Shanshui escaped." Liang Lien's breathing paused, and he coughed violently again. With a puff, he spat out another mouthful of blood. Chi Punmo looked up and was about to speak when he suddenly felt a coldness from the deepest depths of the earth attack his heart. His expression changed dramatically, his feet paused, and his body flew back. At the same time, a mottled small sword that looked like a snow-dyed wintersweet branch came out of his right sleeve along with a powerful wave of primal energies of the universe. The entire tent swelled up under this sudden burst of powerful energy, emitting a heart-palpitating explosion. Liang Lien's expression was still indifferent as he sat motionless. There was a clang in front of him. His life bond sword flashed like a black dragon coming out of the sea. It immediately charged at the thin flying sword that flew out of Chi Punmo's sleeve. It shook the small sword away and stabbed into Chi Punmo's body. With a crash, dozens of cracks appeared in the tent. Waves of energy visible to the naked eye charged out. With a scream, Chi Pumo's body fell through the air with the two curtains and landed in front of the tent door. Pew! Liang Lien spat out another mouthful of blood. This mouthful of fresh blood was a sign that he had suffered an even more serious injury. Chi Pumo's lungs had been torn apart by this sword. His shattered bones and organs were exposed to the air, but he still did not die. His lightless eyes were filled with great disbelief and reluctance. Pieces of flesh flowed out of his mouth, but he still spoke. "Why? You and I understand each other too well." Liang Lien looked coldly at the bright red blood in front of him and looked down. "You and I are the only survivors of many battles. What we are best at is surviving. You are familiar with the places I am familiar with. If I kill you, I will be the only one familiar with our place outside the pass. She wants you to replace me. If I kill you now, I will lead the army there, and I will be the only one left. If I die, you live. Or if you die, I live. You are a very smart person, but you are not vicious enough. You are too slow. Even more importantly, your cultivation is not as good as mine. So after so many years, even though you and I have survived, I am a general and you are just a strategist. Hearing these cold voices, Chi Pumo painfully exhaled his last breath. Liang Lian did not look at his corpse or at the shocked soldiers who had rushed over after hearing the commotion. He thought coldly of that perfect and cold woman and said to himself, "Those who climbed out of a pile of corpses, those who stepped on the bloody path in Chongling will have a harder life. If you want me to die, I will not die so easily." The military flag outside the tent flapped in the wind, muffling his voice at this moment. Chapter 329. South of Chongling, Divinity Bureau. This building that looked like an ordinary Taoist temple gave off a dark and cold presence. Other than a few important people deep in the imperial palace, all the nobility of the Qin dynasty were deeply wary and fearful of this place. But at this time, many people in this building had deep wariness and fear in their eyes. It was all for a woman in white. Yi Sealing walked off the carriage and walked alone along the gray stone path into the cold courtyard. Strands of sunlight fell from the mottled walls and sprinkled on her body. In the deepest part of the courtyard, a carriage was parked next to a dying tree. The carriage was a deep purple, the wood giving off a glossy light. There were patterns carved on it, and the carvings overlapped. It was also inlaid with gold and jade. It was extremely luxurious. Yi Sealing stopped and looked at this carriage. She laughed and said with slight disdain towards the study in the courtyard, "This should be Li Lingjuan's sandalwood carriage. I had not thought that you would take it. The bureau chief of the Divinity Bureau likes such vulgar things." "I do not think about vulgar things. I just like the smell of the wood itself." A flat voice came through the unlatched door, sounding a little hollow. "You do not care about the appearance, but the smell. This wood is hard to come by, so it makes sense." Yi Sealing slowly turned around and did not move. She just looked inside through the half-closed door. Looking at the fine dust floating in the light, she said coldly, "Other people do not know your flying sword cultivation, but do you think I do not know? I have a reason for not wanting Bai Shan Shui to die." "What is your reason?" The person behind the door was silent for a moment. "Do you really not know?" Yi Sealing said, "I really do not know. Putting away the bough after the birds are done." The person behind the door was silent for a moment. "But I am not doing this for myself. No matter who you are doing this for, I hope that you will not do this in the future." Yi Sealing looked up and said calmly and coldly, "I am me, you are you. You should know that I do not want to owe you anything." The person behind the door did not speak. Yi Sealing did not say anything else and turned to leave. However, the moment she took a step forward, the hollow voice behind the door sounded again. "There's something I didn't record in the report. Bai Shan Shui's route is a bit strange. She seems to have gone to some alleys." Yi Sealing abruptly turned around. A yellow-robed cultivator walked out of the carriage and stepped onto the soft grass outside the gates of Min Mountain Sword Sect. The Min Mountain Sword trials had ended, but the cultivation teachers and court officials who had come to watch had not all left. Looking at the yellow robes of this cultivator and sensing his presence, they knew where this cultivator came from. All kinds of emotions appeared in their eyes. This yellow-robed cultivator was extremely respectful and low-key. He exchanged a few words with a blue-robed disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect who was in charge of communication. Then he returned to the carriage and waited quietly, thinking that the noble mistress of the palace was definitely not in a good mood. The teachers of the various cultivation places and the officials of the court did not dare to deliberately stay. Some of them who had originally planned to stay for a while left early. The surroundings of the forest quickly became increasingly quiet. The blue-robed cultivator of Min Mountain Sword sect left and returned. Zhang Yi silently followed behind him, passing through the forest towards the yellow-robed cultivator's carriage. The yellow-robed cultivator had already reported his identity and intentions. However, Zhang Yi did not understand why someone of his status would cause that noble woman to make such arrangements. So, the closer he got to the carriage, the more anxious he felt and the more uneasy he felt. When he saw Zhang Yi's figure, the yellow-robed cultivator walked out of the carriage. Then he bowed slightly to the Min Mountain Sword sect cultivator, and Zhang Yi, who led the way from a distance. Her Majesty told me to give this letter to you, without any extra words. This yellow-robed cultivator said calmly as he looked at the Min Mountain Sword sect cultivator, who had retreated to the side, and Zhang Yi, who had walked in front of him. Then he took out a letter from his sleeve and handed it to Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi's face instantly turned pale. Before he even touched the letter, his hands began to tremble. However, he didn't make any sound. He lowered his head slightly and opened the letter. Looking at the beautiful but powerful handwriting, his hands trembled even more. I know. After reading it 3 times and confirming that he had not missed a word or comprehended the meaning of a word, he bowed slightly to the yellow-robed cultivator and said, "I agree to this suggestion." The yellow-robed cultivator looked at Zhang Yi's pale but determined face and his trembling hands. He reached out as though he wanted to take back the letter. But the moment his fingers touched the letter was shattered by a gentle power, turning into fine dust that spread out in Zhang Yi's hand. This was a powerful cultivation state, but this yellow-robed cultivator, to the perfect woman in the imperial palace, was just an ordinary messenger. In Min Mountain Sword sect, there were some courtyards at the foot of the mountain on the Green Jade Mountain Path. Some new disciples, or those about to enter the sect, like Zhang Yi, lived here temporarily. Zhang Yi returned to his temporary residence. Without greeting Dugu Bai and the others, he closed the door, entered his room, and spread out pen and paper. His face was still pale, but his hands had regained their stability. He quietly wrote a letter and left it on the table. Then he pushed open the door and left. A black cloud slowly flowed through the sky. A black eagle passed through the clouds and suddenly glided past a black mountain. The black mountain was not tall. There was no grass or tree growing on it, but there were countless gravestones of various sizes standing in a forest. There was an imperial entourage parked outside the mountain. There was a grave in a valley near the peak of the mountain. The gravestone in front of the grave was a small crown. The Qi Emperor stood in this valley with a sad expression. In the entire valley, on the entire mountain, only he was standing. When Zhang Yi left the letter and left, he was also looking at a secret letter that had just reached his hand. He was not so calm. After carefully reading the last word of the secret letter, he directly cried out loud. He cried very hard and very miserably. "Teacher, Ruo, you left without any complaints, but after you left, I could not eat or sleep in peace. In my dreams, I often see the Qin army breaking into the city unstoppable. Teacher Ruo, the Min Mountain Sword trials just ended. Do you know that Changling has produced another genius youth like Jing Liuli and Baosher? Teacher Ruo, it is so bitter to think about it. When the Bazin Kendo ground was at its peak, the Qin had produced so many incomprehensible geniuses. Even now, there are still more. Is Yuan Wu really fated? Teacher Ruo, Jing Liuli and Baosher are already unmatched by the youths of the dynasties. In another decade, I fear that no one will be able to match them. But 2 such monsters are not enough. Now, another has appeared. We are fine. You managed to leave behind a disciple like this, but he buried himself with you. What does this mean? Every time I think of this, I want to go with you. Teacher Ruo, if it weren't for the sake of the people of Qi Kingdom, I would have gone with you. The Emperor of Qi cried, without the demeanor of a monarch. His tears flowed. The grave in front of him had been deathly silent and unchanged. Not even a blade of grass had grown. No cultivator could sense an unusual presence, but as his cries grew louder, the soil on the grave started to tremble slightly. It was just the black soil that was trembling, but it gave off a displeased presence that seemed to see through the Emperor of Qi. The Emperor of Qi widened his eyes. He stopped his sorrowful cries and occasionally sobbed. That aura of displeasure became even sharper, as if it didn't like being disturbed in peace. The soil on the top of the grave moved in the wind like burnt ashes. A dot of black light slowly came out. A black grass that gave off a dark and cold presence grew out. This black grass only had 1 leaf. When it grew out, it was facing the Emperor of Qi. But in a flash, the tip of the grass pointed in the direction of the Qin dynasty's Changling. Emperor Qi's sobbing also stopped. After a moment of hesitation, he bowed towards the grave. The moment he turned around, his face was still filled with tears, but there was a layer of joy in the depths of his eyes. Chapter 3:30. This is simply nonsense. Do you think our Min Mountain Sword sect is a city gate where you can enter as you please? You can leave as you please? You are also an idiot. Other people want to send in a letter. You let them send in a letter? Angry reprimands sounded in the mountain valley. Hearing the scolding of the middle-aged man, the young Min Mountain Sword sect cultivator in indigo robes felt extremely wronged. He thought, according to the rules, he should have brought in a letter from an outsider. Also, who was the person who delivered the letter? Could it be that he could refuse whenever he wanted to? Also, who would have thought that someone would choose to leave a letter after entering Min Mountain Sword sect? Sect uncle who, what happened? A cold and authoritative voice sounded from the mountain path. Jing Liuli's figure appeared on the mountain path. Zhang Xiu had someone send a letter to Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi left the sect after leaving the letter. The middle-aged man was still angry. If this was a disciple who barely passed the trials in the past, then so be it. But this year's trials were much more intense than in the past. The people chosen in the end were all talents with potential. In his view, Zhang Yi's performance was outstanding. For all sects, people like Zhang Yi were more important than people who purely knew how to use the sword. He could become the unchanging foundation of the sect. Zhang Xiu had someone send a letter to Zhang Yi, and Zhang Yi left Min Mountain Sword sect. Jing Liuli's eyes narrowed slightly. She glanced at the middle-aged cultivator and said, "What does the letter say?" The middle-aged cultivator of Min Mountain Sword sect put away his anger and handed the thin letter to Jing Liuli. He said at the same time, "He only said that he was able to advance in the trials because of Xia Wan. He feels guilty and asks us to replace him with Xia Wan." Jing Liuli expressionlessly opened the letter and scanned it. She said coolly, "He is clearly a gentleman and needs to find excuses. But he mentioned Xia Wan in passing. This seems hypocritical." While the middle-aged cultivator's seniority was much higher than hers, Jing Liuli had to make the decision on sect matters. So when he heard Jing Liuli say this, he immediately frowned and said, "Then what should we do?" I don't know what Zheng Xiu forced him to make such a choice. For people like him and Ding Ning, you can't force them to do anything. Jing Liuli glanced at the middle-aged cultivator and said calmly, "Zhang Yi should care more about the big picture than Ding Ning." So this is at most a transaction. The only reason Zhang Yi would make such a sacrifice is because Zheng Xiu made a promise to Ding Ning and White Goat Cave's future. After a pause, she looked at the middle-aged cultivator waiting for her answer and said, "There is no difference between cultivating outside and inside the sect. He thinks that he is not a student of Min Mountain Sword sect after leaving. That is just his own opinion. For me, this will allow Min Mountain Sword sect to have another good student. You have seen Xia Wan's performance. She is much better than the other so-called Chongling geniuses." The middle-aged cultivator was slightly startled. He looked at her slightly green face and couldn't help but feel great respect for her. A monster like Jing Liuli was much better than many people in Chongling. Many people will change, but people like Zhang Yi will not change. Jing Liuli glanced at the middle-aged cultivator and then turned to look outside the mountain. She said coolly, "Everything he does is for the big picture. He is sacrificing himself for his junior sect brothers to have a brighter future. So Master should be reassured to put a suitable sword manual in his hands." The middle-aged cultivator did not speak and nodded in agreement. The thin letter landed in Ding Ning's hands. Ding Ning seriously read every word on the letter. Then he slowly nodded at Gungren and put away the letter. Seeing his true calm and not feigned emotions, Gungren said softly, "It seems you really do not worry about your senior sect brother. People like my eldest sect brother, while sometimes wishy-washy, will always be more popular than people like me." Ding Ning looked at him and smiled slightly. "There will always be more people who like him than hate him. What do I have to worry about?" Gungren thought and said, "You do not care where Shui is buried." Ding Ning said mockingly, "Since she can make my eldest sect brother leave Min Mountain Sword sect, no matter where Shui is buried, it will be very grand." Gungren looked at him for a moment and shook his head. He sighed softly. "In reality, your greatest weakness is that you are too mature. Sometimes it is better to be naive for your age to survive in Chongling." Ding Ning said, "Isn't it the same in the end?" Gungren did not discuss this with him. His gaze landed on the half-open sword manual by Ding Ning's pillow. He said, "What do you think of it?" Ding Ning glanced at him. "If you are prepared for me to return to Chongling now, it should be ready when I arrive." Gungren was stunned and said, "Comprehending is really not a problem for you." Ding Ning nodded and said, "This is not a problem. The problem is you have helped me think what kind of great service can allow me to quickly come into contact with the vital energy cultivation method you speak of." Gungren looked at Ding Ning and said seriously, "As long as your body recovers quickly enough, there are ways." Ding Ning did not speak. Gungren continued, "There is a sect uncle who will accompany you back to Chongling." The moment he spoke, the half-closed door was pushed open. A man with a dark complexion walked in. This was clearly a quiet man with a lowered brow. But the moment Ding Ning saw this man, a black rock appeared in front of him. Then more black rocks appeared in front of him, blocking all the space and making it hard for him to breathe. This came from perception. Ding Ning had never seen this man with a dark complexion, but he knew this man's identity. At this time, other than Bailey Sushua, the last of the legendary people of Min Mountain Sword sect finally appeared in front of him. Like Gung Run, Yantai Guanjian, and the others, this was a person who could shake the decisions of the noblest and most powerful in Chongling. His surname was Xiao, and his name was Sharon. Xiao Sharon was his real name, and not a nickname or any other name. His adoptive father, Xiao Xin, had once been the most powerful barber on the Zhao border. The so-called barbers were killers who did not care about right or wrong. As long as they had enough money, they could even kill women and children. Xiao Xin had taken in a group of orphans and trained them to kill from childhood. Xiao Sharon was the strongest among them, because all the other orphans had died, and he was the only one left. Xiao Xian and some of his powerful subordinates had died at Xiao Sharon's hands. When he killed that group of people, Xiao Sharon was only 19 years old. Unlike the other legendary people of Min Mountain Sword Sect, Xiao Sharon was unknown. Even many old people of Chongling did not know that Min Mountain Sword Sect had such a person. Sect Uncle Xiao does not like to talk, but I think with your personality, you will get used to it and will not feel bored, Gung Ren said gently as he looked at Ding Ning's dazed state. Ding Ning laughed. He had a feeling that many people would be unlucky. Then can we depart? He picked up the open sword manual, patted the edge of the bed, and said to Gung Ren and Xiao Sharon. Gung Ren nodded. Xiao Sharon did not speak. He went forward to carry Ding Ning and then walked out of the room. A carriage was waiting for Xiao Sharon and Ding Ning at the end of Min Mountain Sword Sect's Green Jade Mountain Path. Due to his misgivings about Ding Ning's wounds, Xiao Sharon walked very slowly. His back gave off a layer of gentle primal energies of the universe that wrapped around Ding Ning's body. But Ding Ning did not care about this. What he cared about was the flow of vital energy in Xiao Sharon's body. When Xiao Sharon put him into the carriage, closed the door, and rolled up the curtains slightly so that sunlight and air entered the carriage, and the carriage started to move, Ding Ning started to flip through the book. However, his thoughts were no longer on the 7 books of cultivation. The vigorous energies in his body started to flow on a completely new path. As the energies changed in his Energy Sea, Jade Palace, and Celestial Aperture, the vital energies started to flow in his body. Some of the dried-up meridians in his body started to become slightly moisturized, like they were receiving a rain shower. As expected, the methods of Min Mountain Sword Sect were useful. Even the basic vital energy cultivation method of Min Mountain Sword Sect, the 7 books of cultivation, and the mysteries of Xiao Sharon's energy flow were enough to bring great benefits to his body. In the eyes of the Chongling nobility, he had successfully won the Min Mountain Sword Trials. But only he and Zhangsun Qianxuan knew the first thing he wanted to do in these years in Chongling was enter Min Mountain Sword Sect. Entering Min Mountain Sword Sect was the first step to his revenge. You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.